a lonely forensic pathologist. A titanium capsule surgically concealed in the chest of a deceased patient, and the killer shut down all the hospital cameras before she could leave the operating room. On a rainy Chicago night, Celine Vey uncovers the truth that an entire criminal empire has been murdering to cover up. And now, they're coming for her. If you love tense, ruthless, and unpredictable crime stories, hit like, and comment the city you're watching in below so I know how far my story has progressed. Don't leave, because the best is yet to come. The body on table 7 had been dead for 11 hours, but it was still telling secrets. Celine Vey worked in silence the way she always worked. Gloves tight, jaw set, the overhead surgical lamp cutting hard white light across the open chest cavity. The morgue at Chicago Metropolitan was quiet at this hour. Past 2 in the morning, the building reduced itself to institutional hum. Ventilation, refrigeration units cycling on and off, the occasional clang from the freight elevator 3 floors above. She preferred it this way. Quiet meant she could hear herself think. Quiet meant the dead could talk without interruption. The victim was listed as a John Doe, male, early 40s, pulled from the Chicago River 3 days prior. Officially, he was a drowning. The intake form said accidental. The duty physician who processed the initial examination had signed off in under 6 minutes, which was fast enough that Celine had flagged the file when it crossed her desk that afternoon. She'd seen sloppiness before. This felt like something else. The man's exterior presented consistent with water immersion, skin maceration, the characteristic bleaching of the fingertips, lividity patterns that matched a body repositioned after death. But the lungs told a different story. There was less water than she expected. The hemorrhaging in the orbital tissue was wrong for a drowning, and the scar tissue along the lower left rib cage, partially obscured beneath 2 days of delayed decomposition, was surgical, recent, professional. Celine leaned in closer, adjusted the lamp angle, and brought the retractor to bear on the scar line. Her fingers found it before the instrument did. A small cylinder, roughly 4 centimeters long, smooth as polished bone, seated in a deliberate cavity excavated between the 6th and 7th ribs. Titanium, she determined by the weight and the way it caught light when she extracted it. The threads at one end were intact. Someone had gone to significant trouble to place this inside a living person without that person's awareness, or with it, and the incision closed cleanly enough that casual examination wouldn't catch it. She set it in a steel tray and studied the threading. She shouldn't open it here. Protocol was clear. Foreign objects discovered during examination were to be logged, photographed, sealed, and handed to the evidence chain. She knew this. She had written sections of this hospital's forensic procedure manual herself. She opened it anyway. The cylinder contained a folded strip of memory film, archaic technology, the kind used by field operatives and paranoid bureaucrats who didn't trust digital storage. Celine had seen it twice before in her career, both times in cases that had been quietly absorbed by federal agencies before she could complete her reports. She held the strip to the lamp. Names, columns of numbers, dates stretching back almost 7 years. What appeared to be coordinates, account references, and a series of identification codes she didn't recognize, but running alongside them, names she did. A sitting senator from Illinois, a deputy director at a federal oversight bureau, 3 executives from Vantara Solutions, a private biomedical contractor she'd seen in the news months earlier for winning a major Department of Health contract. And at the top of the document, embossed in the film's header like a title on a classified brief, Meridian Foundation, Asset Disposition Records. Celine stood very still. The refrigeration unit cycled. She became aware, in the way that the body registers threat before the mind catches up, that the hum of the ventilation system had changed pitch. Subtle. Almost nothing. The kind of thing you wouldn't notice unless you'd spent years in rooms where the only sounds were mechanical and the dead. She looked up at the corner of the autopsy room where the security camera was mounted. The recording light was out. She looked at the second camera near the door. Also dark. Celine placed the film strip back inside the titanium cylinder and closed her fist around it. She pulled off one glove with her teeth and put the cylinder in the interior pocket of her lab coat, directly against her ribs. Then she stripped the second glove and moved to the workstation beside the body, reaching for her phone. The main lights went out. Not a flicker. not a gradual fade. A single hard cut to black, the way power dies when it's manually killed at the source, not when a breaker trips from load. The emergency lighting system kicked in automatically, red-tinted, low intensity, casting everything in the color of old blood. Celine stood motionless in the red dark, her phone in her hand, the cylinder pressed against her sternum through the fabric of her coat. She heard the autopsy room door open. Not her door. The door to the adjoining suite, the secondary examination room where Dr. Harlan Voss kept his personal workstation. Harlan was her mentor, had been, more accurately, for the past 9 years. He'd recruited her out of her residency, trained her methodology, and covered for her on 3 separate occasions when her findings had conflicted with politically convenient official causes of death. She heard his voice now, muffled through the partition wall, low, frightened, speaking in the broken rhythm of someone being interrogated rather than in conversation. Then she heard something heavy strike the partition wall. Then nothing. Celine moved. She crossed the autopsy room in 8 steps, reached the maintenance corridor access panel beside the biohazard storage unit, and pressed her badge to the reader. The lock released. She pushed through into the narrow service corridor beyond, pulling the panel shut behind her with both hands to prevent the magnetic latch from clicking. The corridor smelled of rust and old concrete. It was barely wide enough for her shoulders, and the ceiling carried exposed conduit and bundled cable runs that she had to duck beneath at irregular intervals. She moved fast, bending low, her sneakers making almost no sound on the textured rubber flooring. She did not let herself think about Harlan. Not yet. If she thought about Harlan, she would slow down, and slowing down would get her killed. She heard the autopsy room door open behind the panel she'd just crossed through. She moved faster. The maintenance corridor connected to the hospital's service elevator shaft midway along its run, and from there to a secondary stairwell that exited to the loading dock at the building's north face. She'd walked this route once, 18 months earlier, during a fire drill, and she cataloged routes the way she cataloged wounds, carefully, compulsively, as a matter of professional habit that occasionally doubled as survival instinct. She reached the stairwell door, pushed through it, descended. She was 2 flights down when she heard the footsteps above her, multiple sets, coordinated, not rushing but moving with a deliberate efficiency that told her these were not hospital security. Hospital security were underpaid, out of shape, and startled easily. These footsteps had the flat, measured cadence of men accustomed to moving through buildings with bad intentions and the training to execute them. She hit the ground floor landing and pushed through into the loading dock. Cold air. The smell of diesel and wet asphalt. The dock was empty at this hour. 2 cargo bays with rolling steel shutters, a single fluorescent tube buzzing overhead, and a door at the far end that opened to the alley between the hospital's north face and the parking structure across the lane. She crossed the dock at a run. Through the alley door. Into the rain. Chicago in October had a specific quality of cold that she had never fully adjusted to despite living here for 11 years. A wet, aggressive cold that came off the lake in gusts and found every gap in your clothing as if it were intentional. The rain was coming down hard, angled, the kind that turned umbrella use into futility and reduced visibility to a matter of yards. Celine pressed herself against the exterior wall of the hospital, breathing through her nose, and tried to think. Her phone had signal. She pulled it now and dialed 911. The call connected. She heard the pickup tone, opened her mouth, and then the automated hold message played. Chicago emergency services were currently experiencing high call volume. Her call would be answered in order. She stared at the phone. She had been a forensic pathologist in this city for 9 years. She understood, clinically and empirically, that corruption in municipal systems was not a conspiracy theory, but a documented institutional phenomenon. She had testified to that effect in 3 separate federal hearings. She had not previously experienced it as a personal emergency. She ended the call. She needed distance from the hospital. She needed to think. She had evidence inside her coat that connected sitting elected officials to what appeared to be a trafficking and organ exploitation operation. The man who had trained her and protected her professional career was almost certainly dead in the room she'd just fled. And she was standing in an alley in the rain with blood. Harlan's blood, she realized, looking down at her lab coat sleeve, on her left cuff. She stripped the lab coat and shoved it into the recycling bin at the alley's mouth. Then she walked. Not ran. Running drew attention in ways that walking did not, and she was still close enough to the hospital that there would be eyes on the streets looking for exactly that. She kept her pace measured, her hands in the pockets of her scrub pants, her shoulders angled into the rain, and she walked 3 blocks north before she allowed herself to turn left onto Ashland and descend into the Damon Blue Line station. The platform at this hour was sparse. A pair of night shift workers in construction jackets eating from a paper bag. A young woman in headphones asleep against the far wall. An older man reading a newspaper folded to the crossword. Celine bought a single fare card from the machine with cash she kept in her scrub pocket as a matter of ingrained habit. She had grown up poor enough that cash in pocket was muscle memory, and pushed through the turnstile. She stood at the platform edge and breathed. The cylinder was still against her chest. She could feel it through the thin fabric of her scrub top, like a coal. Not warm, but present in a way that made it impossible to forget. She thought about what she'd seen on the film strip. The Meridian Foundation was not a name she recognized immediately, but the name had texture. The kind of institutional name designed to suggest benevolence while revealing nothing. The same architecture of language used by every organization she'd encountered in her career that turned out to be doing something it couldn't afford to have daylit. Medical Foundation. The word medical told her something. The asset disposition language told her more. She had processed enough bodies from enough backgrounds to know what asset disposition meant when the assets were human beings. The train arrived. She boarded the 3rd car from the front. It was nearly empty. The construction workers hadn't followed her down. She took a seat near the rear door and watched the platform as the train pulled out. Nothing moved wrong. No sudden appearance of figures on the platform edge. No last-second boarding. She exhaled. For approximately 90 seconds, the train ran normally. The familiar rhythm of the elevated tracks, the lights of the city strobing through the windows, the recorded announcement cycling through upcoming stations. Then her phone buzzed. An unknown number. No caller ID. She stared at it for 3 seconds, then answered. Dr. Vey. Not a question. A man's voice, middle register, precise in its enunciation. You left the hospital 7 minutes ago. You took the maintenance corridor from Autopsy Suite B and exited through the loading dock. You turned north on Ashland and entered the Damon station. Her fingers went cold. You're currently on a Blue Line train traveling northwest. You're in car 3. You're seated near the rear door, and you have the capsule in your left breast pocket. She did not speak. This is not a threat, the voice said. I want you to understand that what I'm about to tell you is a threat, but that I personally am not one. Are you listening? Who are you, she said. Not a question either. The way you speak when questions feel like a luxury you can't afford. That's not what matters right now. What matters is that at the next station, 6 men are going to board your train. They work for a man named Magnus Rayner. You have something Magnus Rayner wants destroyed. The men boarding the train have instructions consistent with that goal. How do you... There's a maintenance access door at the rear of your car. It requires a code. The code is 7714. On the other side is a crawl space that connects to the roof access ladder between cars 3 and 4. You need to move before the train decelerates for the station. Celine looked at the rear door of the car. There was, in fact, a maintenance panel beside it that she hadn't registered consciously. The kind of thing you see without seeing in any vehicle you ride regularly. If you're wrong, she said, I'll be climbing around the outside of a moving elevated train in the rain. If I'm wrong, the voice said, that's the worst outcome. If I'm right and you stay seated, I understand the calculus, she said, and she was already moving toward the rear of the car, phone against her ear, watching the windows for the station platform ahead. She could see it now. The yellow safety strip at the platform edge, the sodium lights. And figures, she counted without meaning to, professional reflex, 6 of them, spaced along the platform in a way that was designed to look like nothing and instead looked exactly like what it was. She punched the code into the maintenance panel keypad. The door released. Cold air and the sound of the tracks and the city underneath hit her like a physical thing. She pushed through into the crawl space, pulling the door shut behind her, and pressed herself against the interior wall of the connecting passage as the train began decelerating into the station. She heard the car doors open. She heard feet on the car floor above her, 6 sets, fast, fanning out. She pressed the phone to her ear and said nothing, and the voice on the other end said nothing, and the train sat in the station for exactly 47 seconds, and then the doors closed and the train began accelerating again. "They didn't find you," the voice said. "I noticed," Celine said. Her hands were shaking. She noticed that too, the way you notice physiological responses when you've been trained to observe them. Detached, clinical, even when they're your own. "Who are you?" A pause. Longer than the previous ones. The kind of pause that has weight in it. "Get off at the next station," the voice said. "Exit through the north entrance. Walk 2 blocks east. There's a parking structure on Elston, level 3, bay 17. A car will be there. The keys are under the left rear tire." "You haven't answered my question." "No," the voice said. "I haven't." And the line went dead. Celine crouched in the maintenance crawl space of a moving elevated train with the skyline of a corrupt city visible through the rain-streaked gaps in the connecting passage. A titanium capsule full of evidence that had already gotten at least one person killed pressed against her ribs, and a dead phone in her hand. She thought about Harlan Voss, thought about the 9 years, the way he'd called her stubborn the first time she'd challenged a ruling, and then, 2 hours later, quietly told her she'd been right. The way he kept a photograph of his daughter on his workstation, even though the two of them hadn't spoken in years. She'd asked him about it once, and he'd said, "Just because something is broken doesn't mean you stop looking at it." She pressed the heel of her palm against her eye socket until the pressure blurred her vision and she couldn't think about it anymore. Then she stood up. The next station was approaching. She had evidence that could bring down a network of powerful people who had the resources to kill her inside a major hospital and make it disappear inside an hour. She had a stranger's voice on a dead phone, directing her toward a car she had no reason to trust. She had blood she hadn't fully processed on her hands, metaphorically, and she noticed now, literally, a small smear on her right palm from where she'd pressed against the maintenance panel door. She had nothing else. The train slowed. Celine moved. Level 3 of the parking structure on Elston was cold and poorly lit and smelled of exhaust and old concrete, the fluorescent strobing in the way of fixtures that had been reporting maintenance needs for 2 years without anyone responding to the ticket. Bay 17 was in the far corner, half-shadowed, which was either coincidence or the point. The car was a dark gray 4-door sedan, nothing distinguishing, plates that were probably clean enough to pass a routine scan but wouldn't survive a detailed query. She crouched beside the left rear tire, felt along the wheel well, and found the key fob wedged up inside the housing on a strip of magnetic tape. She stood with the key in her hand. Every instinct she had that was not strictly rational told her to walk away from this car and find another route, bus, rideshare, on foot until morning. Every rational assessment she could construct from available information told her the same people who'd compromised the hospital's security systems and placed 6 men on a train platform in under 10 minutes had cameras on every other route she'd consider taking. She got in the car. There was a burner phone in the center console, already powered on, and a folded paper map of the greater Chicago metro, which was almost quaint in its anachronism, except that she understood immediately why someone who didn't want to be tracked through GPS might provide paper instead. Beside the map was a small black case, the kind used for medical supplies. She opened it and found a field trauma kit, zip ties, a prepaid debit card, and a single folded card with a handwritten address on the north side of the city. No note, no name, no explanation. Celine put her hands on the steering wheel and did not start the car for almost 2 minutes. She thought about Magnus Reiner. The name had landed when the voice said it, and now it was settling into specific context. She had seen that name in connection with the Meridian Foundation on a grant announcement 2 years ago, a glossy piece of philanthropy journalism that had used words like visionary and humanitarian with the uncritical enthusiasm of a press release reprinted as news. She had filed it away without significance. Billionaires with medical philanthropy operations were not unusual in this city. She thought about the film strip, the dates stretching back 7 years, the language of asset disposition. She thought about the bodies she had processed in this city over 9 years. And specifically, she thought about a cluster of 3 cases from 18 months ago that had troubled her enough that she'd flagged them internally. 3 individuals with no apparent connection whose autopsies had presented anomalies consistent with organ harvesting. Those files had been transferred to federal jurisdiction within 48 hours of her flags. She had heard nothing more about them. She started the car. The address on the card was 40 minutes north in normal traffic and 12 minutes at this hour on empty streets. She drove it in 14, keeping to secondary roads, watching the rear-view mirror with the focus of someone who had never done surveillance driving and was compensating through sheer vigilance. The address resolved to a 3-story industrial building in Andersonville, former light manufacturing, now the kind of adaptive reuse property that housed artist studios and small fabricators, and apparently whatever this was. There was a roll-up door on the ground floor and a pedestrian entrance beside it, and the pedestrian entrance opened when she held the key fob near the reader, which told her the fob had been coded for access, and the person who'd prepared all of this had thought several steps ahead. Inside, a freight elevator, which she took to the 2nd floor. The 2nd floor was a single open space with high ceilings and the ghost of industrial function. Concrete floors, exposed steel beams, the remnants of machinery anchor points in the floor. It had been converted into something functional. Workstations along one wall with monitors and equipment she recognized as signals intelligence hardware. A long table with maps and photographs pinned to a board mounted above it. A couch, a cot, a galley kitchen area in the far corner, and a man standing with his back to her, looking at the map board. He heard her come in, didn't turn. "You drove the long way, Ma," he said. "I was watching for tails." "I know. You made 3 unnecessary turns on the way up Clark." He turned then. "They added 4 minutes, but they were good instincts." Kyle Draven was not what she'd expected, and she hadn't known she'd been expecting anything until the expectation failed to match reality. He was tall, over 6 feet, with the kind of physical stillness that in her professional experience indicated either extreme self-control or a significant capacity for violence, and she had encountered enough of both to distinguish them. His face was difficult to read, not because it was expressionless, but because its expressions were slight, calibrated, revealing only what he chose to reveal and nothing else. He was perhaps mid-30s, maybe older. The overcoat she'd been told about was draped over a chair near the workstations, replaced by a dark sweater. His hands were clean. She noticed the clean hands the way she noticed details in an examination. The faint chemical residue at his wrist that indicated he'd used solvent recently. The slight asymmetry in his shirt collar consistent with a shoulder holster worn regularly enough to create a habitual posture adjustment. "The phone you called," she said. "You said it belonged to one of your operatives." "It did. Past tense. He was killed 4 days ago. His body hasn't been recovered." Cale moved to the table, indicated a photograph pinned to the board. A man in his 30s, the same kind of stillness in his face. His name was Carver. He was embedded inside Magnus Rainer's security network for 8 months. "He was the John Doe in my morgue," Celine said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." She looked at the photograph for a moment. "He hid the capsule himself. Before they took him. It was a last resort protocol. Hide what you have somewhere it can be found by someone who knows how to look. He didn't expect to survive long enough to tell us where he put it." "He didn't survive." "No." Celine looked at the map board. Chicago's geography, annotated in several different hands. She could see the area around the Meridian Foundation's registered address near the medical district. She could see the lakefront, and a point marked near the Streeterville neighborhood that corresponded roughly to the address of the Rainer Biomedical Tower, which she recalled from the Grant journalism as Magnus Rainer's flagship. "You've been watching him," she said, "for 3 years. And you need the capsule." Kyle said, "I need what's on it." "Yes. I need to know who you are before I give you anything." He looked at her steadily. "I don't give that information to people I've known for under an hour. I don't give evidence to people who won't identify themselves." A beat. "Fair," he said, and something in his voice shifted register. Barely, but she caught it. "My name is Kyle Draven. I don't exist in any federal database you'd have access to. I run a network that is technically criminal and functionally opposed to organizations like the one Magnus Reiner controls. 3 years ago, my younger sister was found dead in her apartment. The official cause was suicide. She was 26, and she had spent the previous 4 months trying to document what was happening inside the Meridian Foundation. Selene said nothing. She reached out to a federal contact 6 weeks before she died. That contact works for one of the names on whatever is inside that capsule. The rain was still audible through the building's high windows, the irregular percussion of it against glass and steel. Selene reached into the front of her scrub top and removed the titanium cylinder and set it on the table between them. Cale looked at it. He didn't reach for it. "You opened it," he said. "I'm a forensic pathologist. I open things." "What did you see?" "Names," she said. "Dates, account references, the Meridian Foundation header." She paused. "Enough." Cale picked up the cylinder, turned it in his fingers once, set it back down. He didn't open it. "The men on that train tonight," he said. "They know you have it. They know what you look like, where you work, and that you left through the maintenance corridor. By morning, they'll have run a full profile on you, every address in your history, every person you've had contact with in the last 5 years. I know. You can't go back to any of it. I know that too." He looked at her with something that might have been assessment, or might have been something quieter than that, something she didn't have a clean clinical category for. "I can get you out of the city," he said. "Documents, transport, a place to land, in exchange for the capsule and everything you can reconstruct from memory about what was on the film strip. And then what happens to it? Magnus Reiner faces consequences." "That's not specific." "No," Cale said. "It's not." Selene stood in the middle of a converted industrial space in the north of a city that was actively trying to kill her, looking at a man who had just told her he was a criminal and whom she was nonetheless, on the basis of available evidence, inclined to trust. Not because she thought he was good, but because she thought he was honest about what he was, which was more than she could say for most of the legitimate institutional structures she'd trusted over the past 9 years. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. Cale looked at her. "I have the only copy of that evidence," she said, "and I am not going to hand it to someone and disappear while they use it for whatever their own purposes are. I stay until this is finished. I upload those files publicly when the time comes, my terms." The silence stretched. Then somewhere below them in the building, an alarm. A single short tone, not loud, the kind of alert designed to be heard without being heard by anyone outside, sounded twice. Cale moved to the workstations, pulled up a feed on the nearest monitor. Selene moved with him and looked at the screen, 3 vehicles on the street below. Dark SUVs, parked at irregular intervals in the way that casual parking didn't produce and tactical positioning did. As she watched, a 4th vehicle turned the corner and stopped, and 4 figures climbed out and moved toward the building's entrance with the flat, purposeful efficiency she'd heard on the stairs of the hospital. "They found us," she said. "They found the car," Cale said. He was already moving, pulling the overcoat from the chair. "The plates were clean, but the fob had a passive signature. I didn't account for their hardware being current enough to read it at range." He said it without effect, not apologizing, simply noting a tactical error the way she noted procedural errors in her own work. "We have approximately 90 seconds before they breach the ground floor." He looked at her. "Still want to stay?" he said. And despite everything, despite the blood on her hands and the body of her mentor, and the names on a film strip, and the rain hammering against the windows of a building that was about to be full of men who wanted her dead, Selene Vey looked back at Cale Draven and said, "What's the exit?" The exit was a hole in the floor, not metaphorically. Cale lifted a section of the concrete flooring near the rear wall, a hatch, flush set, counterweighted so it swung on a hydraulic arm rather than requiring brute force, and beneath it was a ladder descending into darkness and the smell of old water and stone. "Service tunnel," he said, "connects to the storm drain network 2 blocks east. There's a ladder up to street level at the far end." Selene looked at the hatch, looked at the monitor showing the SUVs below. "How long have you been using this building?" 14 months. "And the tunnel's been there the whole time." I don't use spaces that don't have secondary exits. He was already moving, pulling a bag from beneath the nearest workstation, adding the burner phone and 2 hard drives to it with the efficient motions of someone who had packed under pressure before. Go down. Wait at the base of the ladder. Don't move until I'm behind you. She went down. The ladder was 12 rungs, iron, cold enough through the thin fabric of her scrub sleeves that it bit. The tunnel at the bottom was roughly 5 feet in height, arched brick ceiling, a shallow channel of water running along the center where the drainage gradient pointed east. The smell was exactly what she'd expected. Old city, mineral damp, the particular underground cold that had nothing to do with weather and everything to do with depth. She heard the ground floor breach alarm above her, the same 2-tone pulse, twice, and then the sound of the hatch descending and Kael's weight on the ladder above her. He hit the tunnel floor, pulled a compact flashlight from the bag, and handed it to her without comment. He carried a second one. He pulled the bag's strap across his chest and said, "Stay close. Stay quiet. Don't stop for anything." They moved. The tunnel ran straight for approximately 40 yards, then jogged left, then right, following a logic that had more to do with 19th century infrastructure planning than anything conceived for human navigation. Celine kept the flashlight aimed at the floor ahead and counted her steps the way she counted everything, compulsively, as a way of maintaining the illusion of control. The water in the channel was cold enough that she felt it through her sneakers where she'd inadvertently stepped in the deeper section near the first junction. Behind them, above them, she thought she could hear the building, footsteps, the vibration of doors being forced, the muffled thud of what might have been furniture being overturned. She didn't look back. Kyle moved differently in confined spaces than he had in the open room above. Lower center of gravity, shorter steps, the adjustments of a man who had spent time in spaces exactly like this and had learned the hard way what made noise and what didn't. She cataloged this without intending to. At the second junction, he stopped her with a hand on her shoulder. Brief contact, firm, released immediately, and stood motionless for 4 seconds, listening. She listened too. Nothing except the water and the distant vibration of the city above. He moved again. She followed. The exit ladder was where he'd said it would be. Iron rungs set into the brick, ascending 12 feet to a steel street grate. Kael went up first, shifted the grate with both hands, and pushed through. He reached back down, and she took his forearm, and he pulled her up onto a wet sidewalk in an alley between a closed laundromat and a Thai restaurant with its lights off. Elston Avenue was visible at the alley's mouth. Nothing wrong on the street. The SUVs would still be at the building's entrance 2 blocks west, and whoever was running this operation would need a few minutes to determine the building was empty and reconfigure their search perimeter. 3 minutes, Kael said quietly. Maybe 4. Where are we going? I have another location, north side, 20-minute drive. He scanned the street. There's a car on Berwyn, 2 blocks north. Different setup than the other one. No fob, key hidden under the hood latch. You have safe houses distributed across the city. I have contingencies distributed across the city. There's a difference. What's the difference? Safe houses you build for stability. Contingencies you build because you expect stability to fail. They walked north. Fast but not running. Running on a city street at 3 in the morning drew as much attention as anything, and the goal was to become invisible, not conspicuous. Celine fell into pace beside him, hands in her pockets, and for a stretch of nearly 2 blocks, neither of them spoke, and the rain was easing off to a mist now, and the city hummed its nighttime frequency around them. She thought about what she'd seen on the film strip. Specifically, she thought about the dates. The earliest entries going back 7 years, the most recent dated 11 days ago. 11 days ago was recent enough that whatever operation those records documented was not historical. It was ongoing. The Meridian Foundation, she said, keeping her voice low. How long has it been running? As a legitimate organization? 14 years? As a front for Rayner's secondary operation? About 9. And no one in federal law enforcement has 3 federal investigations, Kael said, clipped. All 3 were opened, ran for an average of 8 months, and were closed without indictment. The second one got close. The lead investigator transferred to a regional post in Montana 6 weeks before the case was scheduled to go to a grand jury. Transferred or Transferred. She's still there. She's alive and she's quiet, and I suspect she made a calculation about what staying loud would cost her. Celine absorbed this. The names on the capsule include federal oversight. I know. Which means any path through official channels has a high probability of being routed to the people you're trying to route around. Yes. He glanced at her briefly as they walked. That's why the evidence needs to reach media outlets simultaneously with law enforcement. Simultaneous public disclosure makes suppression exponentially harder. That's your plan. It's the operational goal, yes. That's not a plan. That's an objective. A plan has steps. He was quiet for a moment. They turned on to Berwin. You're not wrong, he said. The car on Berwin was a dark blue compact, 4 or 5 years old, the kind of vehicle that existed in such volume in any American city as to be genuinely invisible. Kyle found the key under the hood latch exactly as described. They got in. He drove. Celine watched the streets and said nothing for a while. The seat was uncomfortable in the specific way of cars that had been sat in by people larger than her. The lumbar support positioned wrong, the headrest angle slightly off. Small discomfort. She noted it and set it aside. Your sister, she said. Cale's hands on the wheel didn't change. What was her name? A pause long enough that she thought he might not answer. Lena, he said. How old were you when she died? 31. What did she find before? Records. His voice was level, professionally level, the kind of level that takes work. She was working as an administrative contractor for a company that provided staffing services to Meridian Foundation facilities. She found documentation of patient transfers that didn't match official intake records. People admitted under one identity, discharged or transferred under another, or not discharged at all with no death record either. Disappearances. Systematic ones, with a financial trail. Celine stared through the windshield at the wet Chicago streets. She took the documentation to the federal contact. Who was working for Magnus Reiner, Cale said. Yes, she was dead within 6 weeks. The apartment was staged. Medication on the nightstand, a typed note on the laptop. No prints disturbed, no signs of entry. Whoever did it was professional. And you've been building toward this for 3 years. Carver was the longest embedded operative I've placed. 8 months inside Reiner's security network. What he pulled together before they identified him and took him, he exhaled once, short. It's the most complete documentation of Meridian's operation that's existed outside Reiner's own archives. And it's inside a titanium cylinder in my scrub top. Yes. She looked at him. The dashboard light was low and blue, and it didn't give her much to read from his profile, but she tried anyway. You said you'd get me out of the city. Documents, transport, place to land. That offer was contingent on me handing you the capsule and walking away. That's what I offered, yes. But I didn't take it. No. And you're still helping me. He didn't answer immediately. They were crossing under the L tracks now, the familiar overhead lattice of Chicago's transit infrastructure, the city's bones showing through its skin. You said your terms, he said finally. You stay until it's finished. You upload the files publicly when the time comes. Yes. Those terms are operationally sound, he said. The evidence is harder to suppress if you're alive and able to speak to its origins. A forensic pathologist who recovered the capsule during a routine autopsy is a better chain of custody than a criminal network with a documented self-interest in the outcome. That's a practical argument for keeping me involved. It is. Is that the only kind you make? He glanced at her sideways. Brief. What other kind would be useful right now? She didn't have an answer to that. Or she had one, and it wasn't the kind of thing you said in a car with a man you'd known for approximately 2 hours while being actively hunted across a corrupt city. She turned back to the window. They drove in silence. The second location was in Rogers Park, close enough to the lake that she could smell it through the car's ventilation when Kyle cracked the window to check an intersection ahead. Another converted industrial space, smaller than the first, a former print shop she guessed from the layout, with a street front that still bore the ghost impression of old signage under multiple paint layers. Inside, Less hardware than the first location, more stripped down. A workstation, a cot, a table, a kitchen counter with a single burner hot plate, and a box of provisions. A bathroom behind a door in the far wall. Celine sat at the table. She was tired. She recognized the quality of it. The specific depletion that followed sustained adrenaline, the body's accounting catching up with the demand she'd placed on it in the past several hours. Her hands had stopped shaking, but her shoulders ached and there was a dull pressure behind her left eye that would become a headache if she didn't address it soon. Kyle set the bag down and stood at the workstation, connecting the hard drives to the system there. His movements were economical. He didn't make unnecessary gestures. She'd noticed that he hadn't eaten, hadn't checked his phone, or he didn't carry one, which she suspected, hadn't done any of the small self-maintenance things most people did automatically in moments of pause. He existed in the space between actions like someone who didn't fully trust stillness. She recognized that too. "There's food," he said without turning. "Not much, but I'm not hungry. You should eat anyway." "I know." She didn't move toward the kitchen. "Can you decode the film strip, the encryption?" Carver used a standard field cipher with a custom key. "I have the key." "How long will decryption take?" 2 hours for the full document set, maybe less. He turned then. "There's water on the counter, and ibuprofen in the third drawer if you need it." She looked at him. "How did you know?" "You've been pressing the heel of your hand against your left eye socket for the past 10 minutes. She dropped her hand. She hadn't realized she'd been doing it. She got up and found the ibuprofen and the water and took 3 of them and stood at the counter for a moment with the glass in her hand looking at the floor. "Harlan Voss," she said. Cale was quiet. He would have been in the secondary autopsy suite when they came in. She set the glass down. "The door between the suites shares a wall with the corridor I took. I heard—" She stopped. "There wasn't anything I could have done. I know that. There's a version of this where I go back and it just means they have both of us." "Yes, I know that." She said it again. "I just need to—" She pressed her thumb and finger against the bridge of her nose. He had a daughter he hadn't spoken to in years. He kept her photograph on his desk. Cale said nothing for a moment. Then, "The people who killed him are alive and operational and will continue to be until this is finished." "I know." "That's not comfort. I'm not offering comfort. I'm offering a direction." She looked up at him. "Finish it," he said. "That's the direction." She held his gaze for a moment. His eyes were dark and steady, and there was nothing soft in them. But there was something present, something that wasn't performance or management, and she filed that away in the part of her brain that cataloged things she didn't have categories for yet. "All right," she said. "Then let's work." They worked. Cale began the decryption sequence while Celine reconstructed what she'd seen on the film strip from memory, writing in longhand on a legal pad she found in a drawer because she'd always remembered better through pen than keyboard. Something about the physical act of forming letters slowed her recall into higher resolution. She wrote names, dates, the account reference formats she'd observed, the organizational language used in the Meridian Foundation header. It was meticulous work and slow, and she was good at it. At some point before 4 in the morning, Kyle made coffee on the single-burner hot plate. He put a mug on the table beside her without comment and went back to the workstation. She drank it without looking up from her pad. Around 4:30, the decryption completed its first segment and Kyle called her over. The documents were dense and precise and ugly in the specific way of bureaucratic evil, the way that truly institutional harm expressed itself not in dramatic language, but in the clipped vocabulary of logistics. Patient transfer codes, revenue allocation by facility, line items categorized under organ procurement, viable asset retention, disposal protocol. Names of individuals cross-referenced against what appeared to be medical profiles, age, blood type, organ condition ratings assessed on a numerical scale. Celine read without speaking. She had processed the bodies of people who'd been killed and people who'd died by accident, and people whose deaths were ambiguous and people whose deaths were almost certainly more than the official record suggested. She had been doing this for 9 years. She thought she had a calibrated relationship with what human beings were capable of doing to one another. She was wrong. "How many?" she said. Her voice was flat. Based on the records Carver accessed, Approximately 340 over 6 years, Kael said. That's conservative. There are facility codes in the documents that map to locations we haven't identified yet. She straightened up. 340 people. Minimum. And Magnus Rayner is at the top of this. He built it. He's been running it for 9 years. The political protection comes from the names you saw on the strip. They receive financial consideration and, in some cases, medical services. There are records here consistent with blackmail material as well. Several of the political figures involved were treated at Meridian Foundation facilities under circumstances that would end their careers if disclosed. So they're complicit and compromised, which makes them very motivated to ensure this never surfaces. Celine walked to the window and looked out at the pre-dawn dark of Rogers Park. A street that should have been quiet was quiet. The lake smell was stronger now. She was 2 blocks from the water and the night wind was coming off it. She was thinking about a thing she'd noticed in the document and hadn't said yet. There's a facility code in the procurement records, she said. MCH7. I've seen it 3 times now in the cross-references. Kael looked at her. That's not a code format I recognize from any of the other facilities you've told me about. The others follow a geographic prefix. MCH7 doesn't. Kael was quiet for a moment. MCH7 is the Rayner Biomedical Tower, he said. Magnus Rayner's flagship building. Publicly, it's a licensed surgical center and research facility. The 7th subfloor is not in any public building permit or inspection record. She turned from the window. There's an underground floor. An underground facility. We've known of its existence for approximately 14 months, but have been unable to confirm layout, access, or operational status without getting someone inside the building. Carver couldn't access it? Carver was operational security. He never got below the 4th floor. Kael paused. What's in there, if the records are accurate, is the primary archive. Physical documents, servers, biological materials. The comprehensive evidence of everything the digital records only reference. Celine absorbed this. If we upload what's on the capsule, she said slowly, it's damaging. It's enough to open investigations. But the physical archive provides independent corroboration that can't be dismissed as manufactured or hacked data. Yes, he met her eyes. To get to it, someone needs to be inside the building, below the 4th floor. The silence between them had a specific texture now. You're not suggesting, she started. I'm not suggesting anything, Kael said carefully. I'm describing the operational landscape. You are absolutely suggesting something. I'm laying out the parameters. Kael. She said his name for the first time. It surprised her slightly, the ease of it. If you're going to ask me to go into that building, say it directly. He looked at her. The Rayner Biomedical Tower has a medical staff credentialing program with an accelerated pathway for visiting specialists. A forensic pathologist with 9 years at Chicago Metropolitan and a clean record. He paused, fractionally. Had a clean record. As of tonight, your record is complicated. But not yet widely distributed. Not yet. They know you have the capsule. They don't yet have grounds to flag your credentials through official channels without exposing themselves. So there's a window. There's a narrow window, Kael said, and it's closing. Celine stood in the middle of the print shop in Rogers Park at 4:45 in the morning with 340 dead people behind her eyes and the name of a building that contained the evidence to close every open account these deaths had accumulated. And she looked at the man across the room from her, a criminal, a phantom, a brother who had spent 3 years building toward a moment he couldn't complete alone. And she made a calculation that was equal parts logical and something else she didn't have a name for yet. I need a cover identity, she said. I can have one built within 6 hours. And credentials that will pass the tower's verification system. I have a contact who can manufacture them to that standard. And a clear brief on the building layout as far as you know it. You'll have everything I have. She nodded once. Then we sleep in shifts, you finish the decryption, and at first light we start planning access. Kael held her gaze for a moment, and there was something in it, not warmth exactly, but recognition, the look of one person seeing another clearly for possibly the first time. "There's one more thing," he said. She waited. "The contact who can build the credentials. I need to reach him tonight. He operates on a specific communication protocol and a specific schedule, and if I miss the window, he goes dark for 48 hours. He paused. "I need to step out for approximately 20 minutes. To call him. To reach him. It's a dead drop system. Physical, not digital. There's a location 3 blocks from here." He looked at her steadily. "I'll lock the building from outside. You'll have the workstation. The system is keyed to read only while I'm gone. I can't have you in the decryption files without me present. Those are my terms." She held his look. 20 minutes, she said. 20 minutes. Take 22 and I'll assume you're not coming back. Something moved in his face, brief, barely there, but present. "I'll be back in 18, he said, and he pulled on the overcoat and went out through the front door, and she heard the lock engage from outside. Celine stood alone in the silence of the print shop. She used the bathroom, washed her face in cold water, and looked at herself in the small mirror above the sink, pale, shadows under her eyes, the specific hollow look of a person who had crossed some line in the past several hours from their ordinary life into something with no guaranteed return route. She looked clinical about it. She couldn't afford otherwise. She went back to the table and picked up her legal pad and reviewed her notes. The names on the film strip, one of them she'd written down and then circled twice without fully processing why. Special Agent D. Hargrove, Department of Justice, Oversight Division. She'd seen that name before, not from the film strip, from her own professional history. 14 months ago, when the 3 anomalous cases she'd flagged had been transferred to federal jurisdiction, the receiving agent's name on the transfer documentation had been Hargrove. She sat with this for a moment. D. Hargrove had received 3 cases that Celine had flagged as potentially involving organ harvesting. D. Hargrove's name was on records linking a DOJ official to the Meridian Foundation's financial network. The cases had been quietly closed. Celine's hands were still. She thought about the sequence of tonight, the hospital cameras going dark, the precision of the team that had moved on the morgue within minutes of her finding the capsule, the speed with which they'd found the first safe location, the car with the passive fob signature. She thought about how many people knew she would be in the morgue tonight running a secondary examination on a John Doe. The answer was not many. Her supervisor, the duty scheduling system, and Harlan, who had been the one to flag the case to her attention in the first place. Harlan, who had access to the duty system. Harlan, whose door she had heard open before the lights went out. Harlan, whose voice she had heard through the wall, low, frightened, before the sound of impact. She sat very still. She did not want to be thinking what she was thinking. Harlan Voss had spent 9 years teaching her how to look at things without flinching, how to sit with uncomfortable facts and let the evidence lead rather than the conclusion. She had trusted him with that instruction. She had trusted him more broadly than that, in the way that professional mentorship deepens into something harder to categorize, something closer to family. But the sequence. The capsule found during a secondary examination that he had flagged to her attention, the lights going out within minutes, the sound of his voice, not screaming, not calling for help, talking. At that hour. To someone. She pressed her palm flat against the legal pad and breathed slowly through her nose. She was a forensic pathologist. She dealt in evidence. She did not have enough to make a determination, and she knew it. What she had was a pattern that could be explained multiple ways, and the most disturbing explanation was not the only one, but it was sitting there. She was still sitting with it when the front door opened at exactly the 17-minute mark, and Kael came back in, damp from the outside air, and stopped when he saw her face. "What happened?" he said. Not a question. Nothing happened. She looked up at him. "I've been thinking." "About what?" She held his gaze. "About who knew I would be in the morgue tonight." Kael stood in the doorway. The silence between them was a different kind now, heavier, with an edge. "Tell me," he said. She told him. He listened without moving, without expression, without interruption. He stood in the doorway of the print shop with his hands loose at his sides and let her walk through the sequence, and when she was done, he was quiet for long enough that she started to wonder if she'd miscalculated badly in saying it aloud. Then he moved to the workstation and pulled up a file she hadn't seen before. Harlan Voss, he said. 61 years old. Chief forensic pathologist, Chicago Metropolitan. Widower. One daughter. Estranged. Professional record clean. He paused. Personal financial records show a secondary account opened 4 years ago. Regular deposits. Monthly, consistent amount. Source? A shell company registered to a Meridian Foundation subsidiary. Celine's ears rang. She'd been wrong about many things tonight. She had not been wrong about this. He's been feeding them information, she said, for at least 4 years, probably longer. He flagged that case to me specifically. Because you were the best person to find what Carver had hidden, and when you found it, K.L. looked at her. He told them immediately. The ringing in her ears resolved to something quieter and colder. The sound I heard through the wall, she said. Before the impact, he wasn't being interrogated, he was reporting in, K.L. said. Yes. And then they killed him anyway. Witnesses are liabilities. He'd served his purpose. Celine sat back in the chair. The legal pad with her notes on it was in front of her, and the names on it looked different now than they had 20 minutes ago. Not just institutional corruption, but personal betrayal. And those were not the same wound. She had spent 9 years trusting Harlan Voss's judgment about what was worth pursuing and what wasn't. She had 3 closed cases in her history that she had flagged, and he had signed off on the transfer paperwork without question. She thought about how many times she'd been close to something and walked away because he'd suggested the evidence was insufficient. She thought about the cases she didn't know about, the ones she'd never flagged because she'd never run the secondary examination because the case hadn't been directed to her attention in the first place. How many? She said again. But this time the question meant something different. K.L. looked at her. I don't know, he said. Not yet. Outside the print shop windows, the sky was doing the thing it did in the hour before dawn. Not getting lighter exactly, but getting less dark, in gradients so small you couldn't track any individual shift, only the accumulation of them. Celine picked up her pen and drew a line through Harlan Voss's name on the legal pad. Her hand was perfectly steady. I want everything you have on him, she said. Every transaction, every communication intercept, every piece of documentation. When this is over and the files go to media, his name goes too. Understood. All of it goes. Not selected pieces. Everything. Celine. He said her name the same way she'd said his, with the slight quality of a person testing a word they hadn't used before. Everything goes. I don't make exceptions for people who've been useful to me in the past either. I understand what you're asking. She looked at him. He looked back, and somewhere in the building, not the door, not the alarm, but the workstation, a secondary monitor she hadn't been watching, a new alert populated on the screen. Red text, minimal. She couldn't read it from where she was sitting, but she watched K.L.'s face as he turned toward it, and she saw something happen there. A change so slight it was almost nothing, but she was trained to read faces, and she read this one. What is it? She said. He was already at the workstation. They found something, he said, low, scanning the screen. Found what? He turned toward her and his face had resolved into the expression she was starting to recognize, the one he wore when the options were narrowing and the ones remaining were difficult. They found your sister, he said. She stared at him. You have a younger sister, Maya, 28, lives in Evanston, teaches at the high school there. He paused. 3 of Magnus Reiner's people are outside her apartment building, right now, Celine said. She was already on her feet. Kyle had his phone. Not the burner, a different one, thinner, matte black, the kind of device that didn't exist in any consumer catalog, pressed to his ear before she finished the word. He was speaking in a low, rapid cadence to someone on the other end, his eyes on the monitor, his body angled toward the door with the specific tension of a man calculating distance and time simultaneously. Celine stood at the workstation and read the alert herself. 3 individuals, dark vehicle, stationary outside 1847 Orrington Avenue, Evanston. Observed 4:51. No movement on target residence. Standing surveillance posture. Standing surveillance. Not entry. Not yet. How do you have eyes on her building? Celine said. I don't. Cale lowered the phone. I have a monitoring protocol on addresses connected to anyone whose name surfaces in my active operations. Your name surfaced tonight. The protocol ran your known associates and flagged her address automatically. He paused. It's a passive system. I didn't anticipate needing it this quickly. Who did you just call? Someone who can be in Evanston in 11 minutes. Who? Someone I trust. He looked at her directly. That's the most I can tell you right now, and it has to be enough. Celine held his gaze for 3 seconds and made the calculation she'd been making continuously since she'd first climbed down a ladder into a drainage tunnel with this man. Available information, demonstrated reliability, absence of better options, and said, what do they do when they get there? They extract her, quietly, bring her somewhere safe. Safe meaning one of your contingency locations. Yes. Does she know any of this is happening? She will when they knock on her door. He read something in Celine's face. She won't be hurt. My people don't. I know, Celine said. And she did know, or she believed she did, which at this hour and in these circumstances amounted to the same thing. What's her timeline? How long before the people outside move on the building? Unknown. Surveillance posture suggests they're waiting for confirmation of something, possibly waiting to hear whether the team at your building found what they were looking for. When that team reports negative, Rayner's people will move to secondary pressure points. He paused. Your sister is the clearest one. Celine looked at the legal pad on the table, at the names, at Harlan Voss's name with the line through it. She doesn't know anything, Celine said. She's a high school biology teacher in Evanston. She doesn't know what I do beyond the rough shape of it. She doesn't know anything about tonight. They don't need her to know anything, Kyle said. They need her to be leverage. The word landed flat and clinical and correct. Celine picked up the legal pad and folded it and put it in the interior pocket of her scrub top beside the titanium cylinder, both of them against her ribs now. Evidence and notes. The sum of what she had. Tell your person to move now, she said. Don't wait for the surveillance team to make a decision. Kyle was already back on the phone. She used the time to think. She stood at the window and looked at the pre-dawn street and thought with the same focused deliberateness she brought to an examination. Systematically, without permitting emotional temperature to distort the analysis. Maya was 28 and healthy and had never been in danger in her life in any form beyond the ordinary ambient risk of existing. She taught AP biology and coached the junior varsity swim team and called Celine on Sunday mornings at irregular intervals that roughly corresponded to whenever she remembered it had been a while. They were not close in the way people described close siblings. They did not share everything, did not call daily, did not perform the rituals of intimacy that Celine had always found difficult. But they were close in the way that mattered, which was that each of them knew the other was there, and the knowledge was load-bearing. If Magnus Rayner's people took Maya, the architecture of everything Celine had been holding together since midnight would come apart. They would know that. Cale lowered the phone. 12 minutes, he said. My contact is moving. Tell me about the Rayner Biomedical Tower access plan, Celine said. Not the sketch, the actual plan. Everything you have. He looked at her. We're not sleeping, she said. We're not waiting. We're going to plan the next 48 hours in detail and then execute it before anyone else gets taken off the board. She turned from the window. Start talking. He started talking. The Rayner Biomedical Tower was 42 stories of medical-grade architecture on the lakefront in Streeterville. Glass and steel and the kind of institutional elegance that communicated both wealth and legitimacy simultaneously, which was precisely its function. It housed a licensed surgical center on floors 2 through 8, research laboratories on 9 through 16, executive offices above that, and, according to Kyle's 14 months of accumulated intelligence, a sub-basement level accessible only through a dedicated elevator that did not appear on any publicly filed building document. Access to the surgical floors required active staff credentials from a licensed medical institution. Visiting specialist protocols were processed through the tower's administrative department and typically required a 48 to 72-hour verification window. Cale's contact, the one he'd gone to reach during the dead drop 20 minutes ago, could compress that window. To how long? Celine said. 6 hours from submission to active badge. And the cover identity. Forensic pathology consultant, currently affiliated with a licensed institution in Indianapolis. The institution exists, the affiliation record will exist when the tower's system queries it, and the identity will have enough professional history that a surface-level check won't raise flags. What about a deep check? It won't survive a deep check, Kyle said, but a deep check requires someone to flag the credential for review, which requires someone to have a reason to look harder than the automated verification does. If you present correctly and don't give them a reason, I'll present correctly, she said. I've been presenting correctly in professional environments for 9 years. I know how to be unremarkable. He nodded once. He believed her. She could see that he did, and found that it mattered to her that he did, which was a thing she filed away for later. The subfloor, she said, the access point. Based on Carver's structural assessment, the dedicated elevator is in the surgical wing's eastern service corridor. Access requires a card reader and a biometric secondary. Palm print. He paused. We don't have a palm print solution yet. Yet. There are approaches, none that are ready. What are the approaches? He described them. She listened. One of them, involving a spoofed biometric pad, required a physical device placed on the reader that they would need to build or acquire, and required someone to be physically present at the reader to install it before she presented credentials. You, she said. Someone from my network, yes. They'd need to be inside the building ahead of you. What's the lead time on the device? 6 hours to build, maybe 7. They looked at each other across the table. So we have approximately 6 hours, Celine said, during which your contact builds credentials and someone builds the biometric spoof, and at the end of which we have a window that closes when Magnus Reiner's people finish processing tonight's failure and start tightening security. That's accurate. Then stop describing and start executing. She sat down. Tell me what I need to know about the building's internal layout. Every floor you have intelligence on. Start with the surgical wing. He started with the surgical wing. They worked for 2 hours. Real work. The kind that left physical traces. Annotated diagrams rough drawn on the back of the legal pad's pages. A timeline written in columns. Contingencies mapped against each other. Celine asked questions that were precise and operational and occasionally caught Kyle in the gap between what he knew and what he'd assumed, and each time she caught one of those gaps, she noted it and built around it rather than through it. She had spent 9 years working with incomplete information and learning to distinguish between what a gap meant and what it merely suggested. Kyle was good at this. She'd registered that in the first hour of knowing him, and it had only become more specific since, he thought in systems, in failure modes, in the downstream consequences of each decision point. He was not sentimental about any of it, which occasionally made his thinking feel cold. But cold thinking was what the next 48 hours required, and she was not going to fault him for it. At 6:42 in the morning, his phone pulsed once. He read the screen. Maya is secure, he said. Celine's shoulders dropped approximately half an inch. She hadn't been aware she'd been holding them. She's scared, he added. She's okay, but she's scared. My contact is... She's good with people. She'll have explained the situation as clearly as she could without going into operational detail. I need to speak with her. Not yet. Any communication between you creates a signal that can be intercepted. When you're inside the tower and the operation is running, we'll have enough noise in their system that a brief contact won't matter. Before then, I know, Celine said. I know. She pressed her thumb against the inside of her wrist, just above the pulse point. A habit, checking her own heart rate the way she'd check a patient's. Fast. Not dangerous fast. Just fast. She'll be terrified. Yes. She doesn't... Celine stopped. Started again. She has a person she calls when things go wrong. A friend from college. Maya's going to want to call her. She can't make outside contact until this is resolved. I know that. I'm telling you that Maya won't understand why not, and that's going to make her more frightened. She looked at him. Your person needs to be patient with her. Maya gets angry when she's scared. She'll push back hard. I'll pass that along. He held her look for a beat. She's safe. That part is handled. Stay with the next problem. The next problem. She stayed with it. At 7:15, Kyle received confirmation that the credential building process had begun. At 7:40, he received confirmation that the biometric spoof device was in fabrication. At 8:05, he left the print shop for 20 minutes to collect a package from a secondary dead drop 3 blocks away. And when he came back, he brought a change of clothes for her: dark slacks, a white professional blouse, a blazer in charcoal gray. Not quite medical administration, not quite clinical. The specific, ambiguous professional register of someone who moved between institutional contexts. She changed in the bathroom. She looked at herself in the mirror again. Different than the woman she'd seen at 4 in the morning. Not more rested. She hadn't slept, wasn't going to, but more composed. The clothes helped. The clothes were a kind of armor, the same way her lab coat had always been. The same way that professional presentation was a language she'd learned early to speak fluently because it communicated competence before she had to demonstrate it. She came back out. Kyle looked at her. "Better," he said. "I know," she said. His phone pulsed again. He read it. Something crossed his face, brief, quickly controlled, but she was watching closely enough by now to catch the shift. "What?" she said. He put the phone down. "The biometric spoof approach has a problem," he said. "The device requires the operator to have visual contact with the card reader before you present credentials. They need to confirm placement and activation. The Eastern Service Corridor where the reader is located is covered by internal CCTV with a 30-second refresh cycle. That's enough of a window to place the device, but the person placing it will be on camera. Can the camera feed be interrupted? Yes, but interrupting it flags the security system. The tower's internal monitoring would register a camera drop and likely conduct a sweep of the corridor. So they can interrupt it, but not cleanly. Not without triggering a secondary response, no," Celine thought. "What's the alternative to the biometric spoof? There isn't one we've identified, without a legitimate palm print in the tower's system. Put mine in." Kyle was quiet. "I'm presenting as a visiting specialist with active credentials," she said. "If the fake affiliation is thorough enough to pass verification, can the credential package include a biometric enrollment? Make it look like I completed remote enrollment as part of the credentialing process? Theoretically, if your contact can access the tower's credentialing backend to insert a pre-enrollment record, yes." He paused. "That's a different level of system access than building a false affiliation record. It requires someone inside the tower's IT infrastructure." "Does that exist?" Kale looked at her steadily. "There's a possibility," he said carefully. "Someone who may have access. But accessing it requires contact I've been deliberately avoiding because the contact is—" He stopped. "Say it." "Complicated." "Kyle. There's someone inside the tower's administrative structure who has provided me with information in the past. Not an operative. Not someone who knew the full scope of what I was building. Someone who passed me a piece of data 14 months ago because they had personal reasons to want a specific individual inside the tower's operation exposed." He paused. "Since then, they've gone quiet. I don't know their current status, whether they're still in position, whether they've been identified, whether they're still—" He stopped again. "Whether they're still alive," Celine said. "Yes. And you've been avoiding contact because reaching out risks exposing them if they haven't been identified yet." "Yes." Celine picked up the pen. "Reach out," she said. "This is what the risk is for." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up the phone. The next 4 hours were the closest thing to waiting that Celine had experienced since the night her mother had been in surgery 10 years ago. The specific quality of suspended time when the critical action is happening somewhere else, and all you can do is maintain readiness for when it returns to you. She reviewed the building layout notes. She rehearsed the cover identity in her head, running through the biographical detail that Kyle's contact had built into the legend: name, institutional history, the narrow technical specialty she'd been assigned that would explain her presence in the surgical wing without requiring her to demonstrate knowledge outside her actual expertise. She ate something: crackers, an apple from the provision box, black coffee from the hot plate. She made herself eat systematically, not because she was hungry, but because she needed her body functional, and bodies under prolonged stress made bad decisions on empty fuel. At 10:23, Kyle received a response to his contact attempt. He read it twice. His face did the thing she now recognized, the small, controlled shift. He turned the phone and showed it to her. The message was brief, 4 lines of text. I'm still here. I know what you're building. I know what she found. There is something you don't know. Meet me, in person, alone. There is a name in those records that will change everything. There was a location and a time. A parking structure near the medical district. Noon. Celine looked up from the phone. Alone, she said. That's what it says. And you trust this person? I trusted the information they passed me 14 months ago. It was accurate. He paused. I don't trust anyone completely. Are you going? He met her eyes. Yes. She thought about the operational logic of it. The contact had biometric access to the tower's credentialing system. Without that access, the plan to reach the subfloor had no clean path forward. Without the subfloor archive, the capsule's digital records, damaging as they were, could be argued to be incomplete, manufactured, extracted from context. The physical archive was the difference between a scandal and a catastrophic institutional collapse. I'll be back by 1, he said. If I'm not back by 1:30, I'll know something went wrong, she said, and I'll move independently. If you move independently, move north. There's a contact in Waukegan who can… Kyle. She stopped him. Come back by 1:30. He held her look. That thing again. Present, not soft, but present. 1:30, he said. He put the overcoat on. He went out. The lock engaged. The print shop was quiet. Celine sat with the building diagrams and the legal pad and the muffled sound of Chicago coming awake outside, and she went over the plan again from the beginning, looking for the things she'd missed, the assumptions she'd built on without examining, the way she would review an examination after the fact, searching for what the first pass had overlooked. She found 3 things she wanted to discuss with Kyle when he got back. She did not find what was actually wrong. At 12:47, her phone, the burner from the car's center console, which Kyle had transferred signal coverage to before the second location was established, buzzed. A text from the number Kyle had been using. 1 line. Change of plan. Come to the location. Now. I need you to hear this directly. She stared at the message. He had told her to stay. He had told her the contact wanted him alone. He had locked her in specifically because the location was an exposure risk. She typed back, why? The response came in under 10 seconds. Just come. It's about Lena. Celine sat very still. She looked at the message for a long time. Then she looked at the lock on the door. She found, on examination, that the front door lock could be disengaged from inside using the key fob. She'd observed the mechanism when Kyle had locked it from outside, and the interior release was the same type she'd worked with on hospital storage units. She had it open in 40 seconds, using a card from the provision kit. She memorized the location address from the message, left the phone on the table. Keeping a device that could be tracked while walking into a potentially compromised situation was worse than walking in without it. And she went out into the Chicago morning. The city was fully awake now. Pedestrians, delivery vehicles. The daytime texture of urban life, indifferent to everything she was carrying and everyone who was looking for her. She walked. She took a bus for 4 stops to break any foot surveillance pattern. She walked again. The medical district parking structure was on Wolcott, mid-block between 2 hospital campuses, the kind of infrastructure building that existed in a state of permanent low visibility. She took the stairs to the 3rd level because Kyle had once told her not to use elevators in unfamiliar buildings, and she had incorporated that instruction without consciously deciding to. 3rd level. Bay 34, the message had said. She came around the concrete pillar at Bay 31 and stopped. Kyle was there. He was standing with his back against a support column and his arms at his sides, and the stillness he normally occupied had a different quality now. Not the controlled stillness she'd cataloged over the past hours, but a forced stillness, the kind produced by external constraint. There were 2 men flanking him. A third stood 10 feet away facing her, and beside the third man with her hands folded in front of her and her face arranged in an expression of professional neutrality that Celine had seen in precisely one context before, The expression of someone giving testimony that they'd prepared, stood Dr. Adrienne Marsh. Celine knew Adrienne Marsh. Everyone in Chicago forensic medicine knew Adrienne Marsh. She was the deputy director of the city's medical examiner office. She had been in her position for 6 years. She had been Celine's professional ally, not quite a friend, but an ally, for the same duration. She had been the person who approved the case transfers 14 months ago when Celine's flagged files went to federal jurisdiction. The name on the decrypted records that Kyle had been reviewing when Selani had been making coffee. A. Marsh, medical examiner liaison, Meridian Foundation consultant, active since year 3 of the operation. Celine looked at her. Adrienne looked back. "I'm sorry," Adrienne said. She said it with the flat effect of a person who'd rehearsed it enough times that the words had been processed into something neutral, stripped of whatever they might once have carried. "The contact," Celine said. She was looking at Kyle now. "Your contact inside the tower." Kyle's jaw was set. "I didn't know," he said. "The information she passed me 14 months ago was..." "It was accurate," Adrienne said. "I gave you something accurate, something small, something that pointed you in a direction that I could manage." She paused. "You were getting close. I needed to understand how close." "You've been feeding them his investigation," Celine said. "Not all of it." Adrienne's voice had the quality of a person making a distinction they believed was meaningful. "I managed what he could find. I kept him productive enough to be useful, but contained enough to be safe for Magnus Reiner," Celine said. Adrienne looked at her. "I kept people alive," she said. "Every time someone in the organization decided Kyle's network had become a problem that needed to be solved permanently, I argued for containment over elimination. I have kept him alive for..." "Don't," Kyle said. His voice was low and had something in it that Celine hadn't heard from him before. "The contact who was going to give us biometric access," Celine said. She was thinking clearly, faster than the situation should have allowed, the way she thought in examinations when the evidence was converging. "That was always you. You brought us here." "I brought you here because Magnus Reiner has your sister," Adrienne said. "The 3 men outside her building in Evanston. Your contact got her out, but there was a secondary team. A second extraction, 40 minutes after the first. Your sister is with Magnus Reiner's people now." The concrete floor of the parking structure seemed to shift slightly beneath Celine's feet. Adrienne watched her absorb it. "I don't have authority over that decision. Reiner made it himself when the Evanston surveillance reported that someone had extracted her. He moved the secondary team immediately." She paused. "He wants the capsule. He wants your notes. He wants you to walk away from this. Leave the country, the identity Kyle built for you, and Maya gets returned unharmed within 24 hours. "And Kyle," Celine said. Adrienne was quiet. "Kyle," Celine said again. "That's a separate negotiation," Adrienne said, "with separate terms." Kyle said nothing. His face had closed down to something almost featureless, not blank but sealed, the face of a person who had reached an internal position and locked it. Celine stood on the 3rd floor of a medical district parking structure in the morning light of a city that was doing its ordinary business 6 feet away on the other side of the concrete walls, and she held, in the pocket of a blazer that wasn't hers, a titanium capsule containing the evidence of 340 deaths, and she felt the architecture of everything she'd built in the past 8 hours come apart along its seams. Not because she was giving in, because she could feel exactly how close she'd come to being the kind of person who would. Maya was 28. Maya taught AP biology and coached the junior varsity swim team and called on Sunday mornings at irregular intervals. Maya had never been in danger. Celine looked at Adrienne Marsh and thought about the 3 cases transferred to federal jurisdiction. Thought about the case files that had never surfaced again. Thought about what it meant that the person who'd approved those transfers had been on Meridian Foundation's payroll for 6 years. She thought about 340. She thought about Lena Draven, 26 years old, a typed note on a laptop. She looked at Kyle. He was looking back at her, and in his face was the same calculation she was making. She could see it, The two of them in that parallel moment of arriving at the same terrible intersection between what they each most needed to protect and what the evidence demanded they do. His eyes said, "I won't make this decision for you." His eyes said, "Whatever you decide, I will not tell you you were wrong." His eyes said, "I know what this costs." She had spent her professional life in rooms with the dead, reading the stories their bodies told, the evidence of what people were capable of doing when they wanted something badly enough and had the power to reach for it without consequence. She had processed those stories with clinical precision and had believed, in the way that sustained professional exposure to atrocity sometimes paradoxically produces, that the systems designed to create consequences were worth trusting. She did not believe that anymore. She turned back to Adrienne Marsh. "Tell Magnus Rayner," she said, "that we need 24 hours to arrange the exchange." Adrienne studied her. "He'll want 24 hours," Celine said. "Tell him the capsule needs to be transferred to a neutral location and I need time to verify my sister's safety before I hand anything over. That's a reasonable ask." "He'll understand reasonable." Adrienne looked at her for a long moment. Then she nodded and took out her phone. One of the men flanking Kyle stepped back. The second remained where he was, close, present, the posture of supervised release rather than freedom. Kale moved to Celine's side. He didn't speak. Neither did she. They stood 2 feet apart in the parking structure's gray morning light, while Adrienne made her call, and in the 6 inches of air between them was everything that had been building since a maintenance corridor in a hospital and a ladder and a drainage tunnel, the accumulated weight of a night that had stripped away every professional and institutional layer and left 2 people standing in what they actually were. She felt his hand, brief, deliberate, press against the back of her hand. Not holding, just pressure, just present. She didn't look at him. She looked straight ahead at Adrienne's back and felt the pressure of his hand and breathed steadily and made the decision that she'd already made before she'd said 24 hours. The decision that Adrienne Marsh and Magnus Rayner would not understand until it was too late because they were operating from the assumption that Celine Vey was the kind of person who would protect what she loved by surrendering what she knew. They had completely misread her. Adrienne lowered her phone. "He agrees to 24 hours, she said. She turned. "Celine, I want you to understand." "I understand everything," Celine said. "That's the problem for..." They had 24 hours, and Celine intended to use every minute of them in a way that Magnus Rayner had not anticipated. She said nothing in the parking structure. She let Adrienne Marsh finish her call, let the man flanking Kyle step back to a supervisory distance, let the silence settle into something that looked like compliance. She kept her face arranged in the specific expression she'd learned over 9 years of presenting findings to people who did not want to hear them. Neutral, measured, the face of someone processing information and reaching reasonable conclusions. She was reaching conclusions. None of them were reasonable. Kale walked beside her down the stairwell and out onto the Wolcott sidewalk, and neither of them spoke until they'd walked a full block east and turned south and put 2 more blocks between themselves and the structure. And then he said, low and close, "You're not giving him the capsule." "No." "The 24 hours. His operational time." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "They'll have Maya in a secure location we don't know and haven't had time to locate. We have no access to the tower's biometric system anymore. Adrienne was the path in, and she's compromised." He paused. "And you have approximately 18 hours before Magnus Rayner determines that you're not complying and moves to apply direct pressure through your sister." 16, she said. "He'll move early. He'll want to demonstrate he doesn't honor his own timelines. It's a control mechanism." 16 hours. "Yes." "To do what?" She told him. He listened. They were walking along a commercial street with morning foot traffic, coffee shops opening, delivery workers, people who had slept and eaten breakfast and were carrying the ordinary texture of their days. And she spoke quietly, and he listened without interrupting, which she had come to understand was the form his attention took. When she finished, he said, "The risk profile on the 2nd and 3rd steps is..." "I know what the risk profile is." "Celine, I know." She stopped at a crosswalk, looked at the light. "Tell me there's another approach." He stood beside her at the crosswalk. He didn't tell her there was another approach. The light changed. They had 6 things to accomplish in 16 hours. Kale began making calls, not on the main device, on a third phone that he'd had in the overcoat's interior pocket, a further contingency she hadn't known about, which she was beginning to understand was simply how he operated. Every layer had a layer beneath it, and beneath that another one, built against the possibility of exactly this kind of cascading failure. She used the time while he called to go over the tower's layout in her head again, specifically the surgical wing's eastern service corridor, specifically the biometric reader, specifically the internal CCTV coverage pattern he'd described. The camera had a 30-second refresh cycle. She had an idea about the camera. They reached a bus stop. Kyle finished his second call and lowered the phone. 2 of my people are in position on the north side, he said. They've been running background surveillance on Rayner's secondary properties since last night. There are 3 locations where he could be holding Maya: a residential property in Lincoln Park, a facility in the West Loop that's registered as a private medical clinic, and a secure floor at the tower itself. Which is most likely? The clinic, he said. It's the most controlled environment with the least exposure. It has a private entrance, no public-facing operations, and it's staffed by people who are on Rayner's payroll rather than licensed staff with independent professional accountability. Can your people confirm which location? They're working on it. I should have something in 2 hours. And the tower access. He looked at her. Adrienne Marsh no longer works for us, Celine said, but she was the path into the credentialing system. We need a different path. There is one, he said carefully. Higher risk. Everything from this point forward is higher risk. Tell me. The tower's IT infrastructure has an external vendor who provides maintenance on the credentialing and access control system. Third-party contract, standard in buildings of that scale. They use an outside firm so the internal IT staff doesn't have root access to the security systems. The vendor has a service window scheduled for today. 10 to 12, routine maintenance cycle. She looked at him. How do you know that? Because Carver accessed the tower's vendor scheduling system 8 months ago, and I've been monitoring it since. He paused. The maintenance technician has a valid service credential that allows temporary elevated access to the access control backend. If we can intercept the technician before they arrive at the building and replace them. Briefly, long enough to insert a biometric enrollment record and a visiting specialist credential in the system. He looked at her steadily. The technician is a single individual, male, 29, contractor through a company called Veritex Systems. He drives a gray panel van, parks in the tower's contractor bay on the subground level. If he doesn't show up for the service window, the tower's IT department will call the vendor company, and the vendor company will send a replacement, and the window becomes complicated, so there can't be a gap. Someone has to be in that van within 30 minutes of the window opening. Celine thought, I can't pass as a male IT technician, she said. No. He paused. I can. She looked at him. I know the system well enough to perform the surface-level functions of the maintenance call, he said. Carver's documentation includes access to the vendor's service protocols. I've read them. He met her eyes. It puts me inside the tower at the same time you're presenting at the main entrance as a visiting specialist, with Rayner's security people potentially recognizing you. Contractor entrance is separate from the main. Different staff, different monitoring. He said it without effect, not dismissing the risk, simply locating it accurately. I've been invisible in this city for 3 years. I can be invisible for 2 hours more. The bus came. They got on. The next 5 hours were the most operationally dense of Celine's life, and she had once spent 6 consecutive hours in an autopsy suite working a quadruple homicide with a broken HVAC system and 2 federal observers looking over her shoulder. She and Kyle moved through 4 different locations across the city, collecting materials from 2 dead drops, meeting briefly with a member of his network, a woman in her 50s named Brecht, who gave them a bag without speaking and left without being introduced. And at each stop, she refined a different component of what they were building. At 2 in the afternoon, Kyle's surveillance people confirmed Maya's location, the West Loop Clinic. Positive ID on 2 of Rayner's known security personnel entering the building, vehicle match on the extraction team that had taken Maya from Evanston, no sign of public-facing activity consistent with the clinic's licensed registration. How many inside? Celine said. Minimum 4, possibly 6, He paused. Plus staff. Staff meaning people who aren't there voluntarily. Staff meaning I don't know. She looked at the confirmation message on the phone. Maya's face wasn't in it. There was no photograph. But the location data was specific and the surveillance confidence was high. We secure Maya before the tower operation, she said. That happens first. If we move on the clinic before the tower, Rayner's people inside the tower will have warning. Simultaneous then, she said. We split the operation. Your people take the clinic. You and I take the tower. My people taking the clinic means an extraction under guard. That's it. Tell me they can't do it. He looked at her. Tell me they can't do it, and we build a different sequence, she said. But if they can do it, he said. Then that's the plan. He made the call. At 4:15, the visiting specialist credential for a doctor. Sarah Vane, forensic pathology consultant, Indianapolis affiliation, was confirmed as insertable into the tower's system during the maintenance window. Kyle had spent 40 minutes in the back of a nondescript van parked on Lower Walker Drive, constructing the technical approach, with Celine sitting beside him reviewing the building diagrams they'd reconstructed from memory, annotating them with everything she determined in the past 6 hours about sightlines and timing and the specific 30-second rhythm of the CCTV refresh cycle she intended to exploit. At 5, they separated. Kyle took the van, the contractor identity, and the service credential documentation. Celine took the blazer, the built cover identity, and the titanium cylinder, which was staying with her, against her ribs, until the moment she uploaded its contents to servers that Magnus Reiner couldn't touch. She walked to the tower. The Reiner Biomedical Tower in the late afternoon light was exactly what it was designed to be. Authoritative, permanent, the architectural expression of institutional confidence. The lakefront light hit the glass in a way that made it look almost transparent, which she suspected was intentional. Buildings that looked like they had nothing to hide were designed by people who had a great deal to hide and understood that the best concealment was aesthetic. She went through the main entrance at 5:40. The lobby was exactly what a surgical center and research facility looked like. Clean, expensive, the subdued color palette of medical environments designed to communicate calm. A reception desk staffed by 2 individuals. A security checkpoint with badge readers. Visible cameras at 4 points. Plainclothes security, 2 individuals she identified by their posture and their shoes. Wrong for the building, right for standing around in one position for extended periods. She walked to reception without hesitation. Hesitation was the thing you couldn't afford. Dr. Sarah Vane, she said. I have a consulting appointment with the surgical pathology team. I believe Dr. Marcus Holt's office processed the visiting specialist request this morning. The receptionist checked the system. Celine stood and breathed and did not think about Kyle in the contractor entrance, did not think about the clinic in the West Loop, did not think about Maya, did not think about anything except the persona she was occupying and the fact that the credential was either in the system or it wasn't, and either way, the next 15 seconds would tell her. Dr. Vane, the receptionist said, I have you here. Consulting visit, surgical pathology, 5:45 appointment. She printed a visitor badge. If you'll have your palm scanned at the reader to your right for biometric enrollment. Celine placed her palm on the reader. The light went green. She felt something in her chest release. Not relief exactly, more like the absence of a specific tension she'd been carrying for 8 hours. Thank you, Dr. Vane. Dr. Holt's assistant will meet you on the 6th floor. Celine clipped the badge to the blazer's lapel and went to the elevator. Cale was somewhere in this building. She rode to 6. Dr. Holt's assistant was a young man named, according to his badge, Christopher, who walked her through a brief orientation of the surgical pathology floor with the efficient pleasantness of someone who did visitor orientations regularly and had made peace with the repetition. She asked 3 questions that were precisely calibrated to sound like professional curiosity, while actually extracting information about the floor's layout, the location of the Eastern Service Corridor, and the staffing pattern of the corridor-level security. Christopher answered all 3 without registering what he was answering. She spent 22 minutes on the 6th floor, reviewing the pathology suite with the attending technician, asking questions about sample processing workflow that were real enough to be convincing and technical enough to establish her cover's credibility. She was fully present in this performance. She had to be. The attending technician was sharp and would notice inattention, while simultaneously running a parallel track in the back of her mind that was monitoring time, positioning, the sequence she needed to execute. At 6:18, she excused herself to find the restroom. She did not go to the restroom. She went to the stairwell, down 2 floors to the eastern service corridor on 4. The corridor was exactly as the diagrams had described. Narrow, utilitarian, exposed conduit overhead, the service infrastructure of the building showing through the public-facing finish. The CCTV camera was where Kyle had said it would be, mounted at the corridor's midpoint, angled to cover the approach to the biometric reader. She checked her watch. 6:21. She needed to be at the reader at the top of the refresh cycle. She watched the camera's indicator light, dim, barely visible, but present, and counted the cycle. 27 seconds. 28. The light pulsed at 31, which meant the refresh was running slightly slow, which gave her 31 seconds from pulse to pulse. She could cross the corridor in 9. She went at the next pulse. 9 steps. Heels silent on the service floor, and she was at the reader with 22 seconds remaining in the cycle. She placed her badge, placed her palm, waited through 2 seconds that felt like they had mass and weight and duration beyond their actual measure. The reader accepted her. The elevator at the corridor's end opened. She stepped in. The elevator descended. Sub-basement. The doors opened onto a space that was the architectural opposite of everything above it. Raw, functional, the aesthetics of concealment rather than presentation. Concrete walls, overhead industrial lighting, the smell of circulated air and cold storage, and something underneath that she identified professionally and immediately as the particular odor signature of surgical environments that processed biological materials in volume. She moved. The subfloor was a single large space divided by internal partition walls into sections she recognized from the record's facility codes. A record storage area, a server room, a cold storage corridor, and at the far end, behind a second biometric door, the operating theater she'd read about in Carver's documentation. She went to the server room first. The upload was the priority. Everything else was secondary. She extracted the titanium cylinder. She opened it. She had brought what she needed in the pocket of the blazer, a small transfer device built into a standard-looking pen that Brecht had handed over without explanation that could read the film strip and convert it to transmittable data. She'd practiced the connection twice during the afternoon, and she did it now with steady hands, coupling the transfer device to the cylinder's film strip and connecting the device's output to the server room's maintenance port, which was accessible and unguarded because secure facilities were routinely undermined by the mundane human tendency to leave service access points unlocked for the convenience of maintenance staff. She initiated the upload. The transfer device was set to broadcast to 3 simultaneous destination servers, 2 international media outlets whose security contacts she'd identified during the afternoon's research, and 1 federal oversight body outside Chicago's jurisdictional reach. Not domestic, not routed through any agency whose name appeared on the capsule's records. She watched the progress indicator on the transfer device's small screen. 18%. She heard footsteps above her. Not Kyle's. Too many. Too fast. The coordinated pattern she'd heard in the hospital stairwell the night before. 26%. She pressed herself against the server room wall beside the door, out of the direct sightline from the corridor. The footsteps reached the elevator. She heard the doors open, heard them enter the subfloor. 38%. 2 voices in the corridor outside the server room, low, communicating in the clipped shorthand of people who worked together regularly in operational contexts. She couldn't hear the words. She didn't need to. The direction of the footsteps told her enough. They were doing a sweep. 49%. The server room door handle moved. Celine had the transfer device in her hand and the cylinder in her pocket, and she was standing against the wall beside the door when it opened. And when the first man came through, she hit him with the transfer device across the temple. Not the right tool for the job, not designed for impact, but the human temple was the human temple regardless of what you hit it with, and she hit it with everything she had, and he went down. The second man in the doorway was faster, She took his forearm on her shoulder when he swung, and it hit hard enough that she felt the impact in her teeth. And she went sideways into the server rack and caught herself and drove her elbow back into his sternum, which bought her 1 second, and she used the second to put both hands on the server rack edge and kick him directly in the knee. Not elegant, nothing elegant about any of this, pure anatomical logic. And he went down differently than the first one, slower, with more noise. She hit the floor. Check the transfer device, 63%. She heard the elevator again. She was breathing through her mouth, short and fast, her left shoulder sending reports of damage that she was categorizing and setting aside. Functional, painful, not a crisis. The first man on the floor was unconscious. The second was conscious and attempting to stand, which she addressed by removing the handgun from his holster before he remembered it was there. She had held firearms twice in her professional life. Both times it required safety certifications that Chicago Metropolitan mandated for forensic staff entering active crime scenes. She knew the mechanical basics. She held it pointed at the floor and breathed. The elevator doors opened in the corridor. 77%. A voice from the corridor, a voice she knew. Magnus Raynor was not what his press photographs suggested, which was the universal condition of powerful people who employed professional photographers. He was shorter, older in the face, with the specific quality of physical presence that came not from size or appearance, but from decades of operating in rooms where everyone else was paying attention to him. He wore a suit that cost more than most people's monthly income. He came through the server room door with 2 men behind him, and he looked at Celine on the floor with the second man's gun pointed at the floor and his 2 unconscious or incapacitated people beside the server rack, and his face did something complicated that was not quite surprise. "Dr. Vey," he said. He said it the way people say a name when they've been saying it internally for long enough that hearing it aloud feels redundant. "Mr. Raynor," she said. He looked at the transfer device connected to the maintenance port, looked at the progress indicator, 88%. "You should know," he said, "that the upload will fail. The building's external communication infrastructure can be isolated from inside the security control room, which was the first thing my people did when they confirmed you were in the building." She looked at him. "You've isolated the building's external communications," she said. "Yes." "When did you do that?" "Approximately 4 minutes ago." 91%. He was looking at the indicator too. She watched him look at it. 4 minutes ago, the upload was at approximately 30%. The transfer device was broadcasting to 3 destination servers. If the building's external communications had been isolated 4 minutes ago, the upload window was open for the first 27% of the transfer, she said, aloud. Not to him, but to herself, the way she talked through evidence in an empty autopsy suite. His face shifted, 94%. "The first server received data before the isolation," she said. "The second server's connection was established before isolation. The data's already—" Raynor moved, not himself. The 2 men behind him moved, and they moved fast and professionally, and Celine brought the gun up and her hands were shaking badly enough that she made a conscious decision not to fire, because the decision tree for firing a weapon in a room full of server infrastructure when she wasn't certain she could shoot straight was not a decision tree she wanted to run, and instead she backed against the server rack and the transfer device hit 97%, and one of Raynor's men grabbed her wrist and the gun went sideways. She kept her grip on the transfer device. 98. The man had her wrist and her shoulder was sending critical reports now, not just informational ones, and she twisted with everything she had and got one hand free and hit 99. The server room door crashed open. Not Raynor's people this time. Kyle came through the door moving in a way that Celine had not seen before. Not the controlled stillness of the past 16 hours, but something that had shed all its management. The thing that lived underneath the stillness, and it was fast and precise and absolute. The first of Raynor's men was on the floor before Celine fully processed that Kyle had entered the room. The second lasted longer, 5 seconds, maybe 6, the sounds of it ugly and functional. She hit 100%. She pulled the transfer device from the port and held it in both hands and looked at the screen. Transfer complete. 2 of 3 servers confirmed. 2 of 3. Enough. Magnus Rayner was standing at the far end of the server room with his hands at his sides and his face arranged in an expression she would have called professional composure if she hadn't spent her career reading the physiological tells that composure tried to cover. His breathing was elevated. His left hand was doing something involuntary. A micro tremor. Almost nothing. The kind of thing you saw in people whose bodies were responding to threat assessment that their minds hadn't caught up with yet. Kyle stopped between Celine and Reiner. He was bleeding from somewhere above his left eyebrow. He didn't appear to have registered this. The three of them stood in the server room in the specific silence of a situation that had reached a pivot point. Reiner looked at Kyle. "You know," Reiner said, "that nothing in those files proves personal culpability on my part. Financial records, organizational charts, facility codes, all of it can be attributed to operational subsidiaries," Kyle said. His voice was perfectly level. "Yes, I've heard that argument. Your lawyers have been making it internally for 3 years. Then you understand." "I understand," Kyle said, "that you murdered my sister." The micro tremor in Rayner's left hand stopped. His face changed in the way faces change when a conversation shifts onto terrain that was expected but is no less dangerous for being expected. "That was a determination made by the medical examiner's office," Rayner said carefully. "The medical examiner's office that was on your payroll," Celine said. Rayner looked at her. "Adrienne Marsh has been a Meridian Foundation consultant for 6 years," she said. "That's in the records. Along with 4 other institutional positions that allowed you to route findings, close investigations, and transfer cases before they reached people who'd look at them honestly." She paused. "Those records are now on 2 international media servers and a federal oversight inbox outside your operational reach." Rayner's face did another thing. Not the tremor, something deeper. "The physical archive is in this building," Kyle said. "The operating theater. And the evidence there doesn't require interpretation. It doesn't require a forensic accountant to trace. It's the kind of evidence that rooms full of lawyers can't reframe." He took one step forward. "And we're going in." Rayner said, "Your sister came to me." Kale went very still. "She came to my office," Rayner said. "She sat across from me at my desk. She told me what she had and what she intended to do with it." He paused. The deliberateness of it was the most frightening thing about him. The sense that he'd had this conversation rehearsed. She wasn't stupid. She understood the risk. "I gave her a choice." "Stop," Kyle said. "She chose—" "Stop talking." "She chose to walk away," Reiner said. "She chose to take the money and leave the country and let it—" Kyle closed the distance between them in 2 steps and hit Magnus Rayner once, open palm, against the side of his face, and the sound of it in the server room was flat and final, like a door slamming on everything that had come before it. Rayner went sideways into the partition wall and stayed there, one hand against the concrete, blood at the corner of his mouth. He looked up. Kale was standing over him, and his face had no expression at all, and his hands were at his sides, and the stillness was back. Not controlled, not managed, just absolute. The stillness of a decision that had been made so completely it had settled into the body. "She didn't walk away," Kyle said. Quiet. The quietest he'd spoken since Celine had known him. "You killed her anyway. You took the money back and you staged the scene and you put a typed note on her laptop and you told yourself it was clean." Rayner said nothing. "Tell me it wasn't you," Kale said. "Tell me it was someone else. Someone you ordered. Someone you can put distance between yourself and—" Rayner's face in the fluorescent light of the subfloor server room was the face of a man calculating, still, even now, the angles of an exit. "I'm not telling you anything," Rayner said. "I know," Kyle said. "I don't need you to." From somewhere in the building, above them, the floors they'd come through, the public-facing infrastructure of a structure built to project legitimacy, they heard the sound of movement. Many people. Coordinated, purposeful, the kind of organized entry that had a specific acoustic signature she'd heard once before from the wrong side of a door. Federal agents. Celine looked at Kyle. He looked back. The data had reached the oversight server. Someone had moved faster than either of them had expected. Rayner heard it too. She watched his face in the moment he heard it, watched the calculation running, the angles, the exits, and watched the calculation reach its terminus. There were no angles left. Celine looked at the transfer device in her hands. Complete. 2 of 3 servers. The data was out. The physical archive was one door away in the operating theater with everything it contained. 340 names, the operational history of 9 years of institutional evil built on the premise that the right money and the right leverage could make anything disappear. She looked at Magnus Rayner against the wall, with blood at the corner of his mouth and Kyle standing over him. She looked at the server room door. She thought about Harlan Voss's photograph on his workstation, the daughter he hadn't spoken to in years, kept because broken things still deserved to be looked at. She thought about Lena Draven, 26, a typed note on a laptop. She thought about 340. Above them, the building shook with the concussive impact of a forced entry on multiple. The building shook twice more, and then the shaking became footsteps, and the footsteps became voices, and the voices became the specific organized language of federal entry teams, moving through floors with the methodical sweep pattern of people who had warrants and the authorization to use them. Celine stood in the server room with the transfer device in her hands, and Magnus Rayner against the wall and Kyle beside her, and she made a decision in approximately 2 seconds that she had been building toward without knowing it since she'd first pressed her badge to a reader in a hospital maintenance corridor the night before. She put the transfer device in her blazer pocket. She looked at Kyle. "The operating theater," she said. "Now, before they reach this floor." He moved. She followed. The subfloor corridor was 30 feet of functional concrete between the server room and the second biometric door, and Kyle covered it fast, Celine a step behind, and she heard Reiner behind them in the server room make some sound. Not a call for help, not a shout, something more involuntary than either, the sound of a man who had run the angles one final time and found them all closed. The biometric door required her palm again. The enrollment Kyle had inserted during the maintenance window had covered all subfloor access points. The light went green. The door opened. The operating theater was large and cold and lit by the kind of overhead surgical lighting that revealed everything it touched with absolute impartiality. The same quality of light she worked under every day, the same unforgiving neutrality. And in it the room looked like what it was, a facility designed for procedures performed on people who had not consented to be there. 3 examination tables, cold storage units along the west wall, a medical records wall floor to ceiling, physical files and labeled binders, the kind of analog archive maintained specifically because it couldn't be remotely accessed or digitally wiped. A server cluster in the northeast corner, separate from the main building infrastructure, air-gapped, the kind of isolated system used by people who understood that the most dangerous information was the information you couldn't afford to have networked. And on the south wall, mounted behind a locked glass panel, drives, dozens of them. Physical storage in a format she recognized as the kind used for long-term secure archiving. The format Carver's documentation had referenced in the facility records as the primary evidence repository. Kyle went directly to the server cluster. Celine went to the records wall. She pulled the first binder. The label read MCH-7/patient transfer/Q1 to Q3YR1. She opened it. The contents were exactly what the digital records had referenced, and worse for being physical. Not data points and facility codes, but actual forms, actual names, actual photographs stapled to intake documentation. People. Each file was a person. Each person had a name, a photograph, an intake date, and in most cases a final disposition notation that was written in the clipped administrative language of a system that had found a way to describe human beings as inventory. She stood in the operating theater of the Rayner Biomedical Tower's undocumented subfloor and held a binder full of the clearest evidence she had ever handled in 9 years of forensic practice. And for exactly 4 seconds she let herself be in the full weight of it. Let it land without clinical management, without the professional distance she used to make the work survivable. And it was exactly as heavy as it should have been, and she did not look away from it. Then she put the binder under her arm and moved to the next one. She pulled 6 binders. Kale was working the server cluster with the focused speed of someone who knew what they were extracting and had prepared for exactly this. Above them, the federal sweep was progressing floor by floor. She could track it by sound, the pattern moving downward, systematic, and she estimated 4 minutes before they reached the subfloor elevator. "How long?" she said. 2 minutes for the drive extraction, Kyle said. He didn't look up. "Make it 90 seconds. He made it 83. They came out of the operating theater into the subfloor corridor with 6 binders, 2 extracted drives, and the transfer device, and Magnus Reiner was gone from the server room. Celine registered this with the part of her brain that tracked tactical information and moved it to the part that assessed immediate versus downstream threat. Reiner, without his people, in a building being swept by federal agents, had approximately 2 options, and both of them ended the same way. She could hear the elevator coming down. She and Kyle stood in the subfloor corridor with everything they'd come for and looked at each other in the fluorescent light, and she thought, not for the first time in the past 20 hours, that this was the most clearly she had ever seen another person. The specific clarity that came from sustained high-stakes proximity, from watching someone make decisions under conditions that stripped away everything non-essential. She thought he was looking at her the same way. The elevator doors opened. 3 federal agents came through in the entry posture, weapon forward, sweep pattern, tactical lighting, and stopped when they found 2 people standing calmly in a subfloor corridor holding physical files and hard drives. "Hands," the lead agent said. Celine raised hers. The binders made it awkward. She held them anyway. "My name is Dr. Celine Vey," she said. "I'm a forensic pathologist at Chicago Metropolitan Hospital. Everything in my hands is physical evidence from the archive in the operating theater at the end of this corridor." She paused. "I need to speak to whoever is running this operation." The lead agent looked at her. Then he looked at Kyle. Kale had his hands raised and his face was doing the sealed thing, and she knew he understood that the next several hours were going to be complicated for him in ways they were not going to be for her, and she knew he had known this coming in. "There is a man named Magnus Reiner who was in the server room approximately 4 minutes ago," Celine said to the lead agent. "He did not have an exit from this floor, and he was not in the operating theater when we came through. There's a cold storage corridor to the west." She paused. "You should clear it immediately." The lead agent looked at his team. 2 of them moved down the corridor. He looked back at Celine. "Who are you?" he said to Kyle. "He's with me," Celine said. "That's not an answer." "I know," she said. "I'll explain everything to whoever is running this operation, not in this corridor." The agent held for a moment. Then he said, "Come with me," and they came. Magnus Reiner was found in the cold storage corridor 11 minutes later. He was not trying to hide. He was standing in the middle of the corridor with his hands at his sides and his face arranged in the expression of a man who had made a decision that had cost him everything he'd built and was now in the process of understanding what that cost felt like from the inside. He offered no resistance. He said nothing when they cuffed him except one sentence, very quiet, that the agent nearest him later reported as, "I want my attorneys." He got his attorneys. They were very good attorneys. It didn't matter. The federal team running the operation was out of the DOJ's Public Integrity Division, cross-jurisdictional, assembled specifically to avoid Chicago's compromised institutional infrastructure. Celine learned this in the first 20 minutes of a 4-hour debrief that began in the subfloor corridor and moved progressively through the building as the sweep completed each level. The lead investigator was a woman named Carrasco, compact, precise, with the specific quality of professional attention that Celine recognized as the kind developed by people who had been lied to by important people many times and had learned to listen for the gaps between the sentences. Celine gave Carrasco everything, not in the negotiated, managed way that institutional testimony typically worked, not the careful version assembled with counsel, the shaped narrative designed to protect what could be protected while releasing what had to be released. Everything. The full sequence from the moment her blade had found the titanium capsule in a dead man's ribcage to the moment she'd stood in the operating theater with 6 binders of human beings reduced to inventory notation. The names, the film strip, the digital records on the server, Adrian Marsh, Harlan Voss, The federal contact that Lena Draven had trusted and who had passed her information directly to the man who'd had her killed. She gave Carrasco the transfer device and the confirmation that 2 international media servers had received the data before the tower's communications were isolated. Carrasco looked at the confirmation screen for a long moment. "The data is already public," Cellini said. "I understand what that means," Carrasco said. "Then you understand that the containment window is closed," Cellini said. "Whatever happens in this building tonight, whatever legal process follows, those records are in newsrooms on 2 continents. The story is already written. What you're deciding now is whether the institutional response is coherent enough to be part of that story or whether it arrives after the fact and looks like it was dragged into it." Carrasco held her look for a moment. "You should have come to us first," Carrasco said. "Every federal pathway I had was compromised," Celine said. "Your division included... I didn't know about your operation until 45 minutes ago. The names on the capsule include a DOJ oversight official." She paused. "Would you have come to you first?" Carrasco said nothing for a moment. "No," she said finally. "Probably not." They were in the 6th-floor surgical pathology suite by this point. Cellini seated at the consultation table, Carrasco across from her, 2 other members of the federal team at workstations in the corner processing the digital evidence. Through the suite's window, the Chicago skyline was beginning its transition to full night, the lake invisible in the dark beyond the glass but present in the quality of the air. "The man who came into the building with you," Carrasco said. Celine waited. "Kael Draven," Carrasco said. She said it the way Kael's name was always said by official entities, with the specific weight of someone who had encountered the name in a context that created more questions than it resolved. "He's being processed separately." "I know." "His legal status is complicated," Celine said. "I know that too. He runs a criminal network. He ran an 8-month intelligence operation against a human trafficking organization with 340 documented victims," Celine said, "using methods that the legal system couldn't use because the legal system was compromised. I understand that creates a classification problem. I'm telling you what it produced." Carrasco looked at her. "I'm not asking you to not charge him," Celine said. "I'm asking you to look at the full picture before you decide what he is." Carrasco wrote something on her pad. Celine couldn't see what it was. Maya arrived at the Federal Processing Center at Dirksen at 9:47 that evening, escorted by 2 members of Kael's network, a man and a woman, both of whom declined to provide identification, and both of whom were allowed to leave after a 30-minute interview with Carrasco's team, a negotiated outcome that Cellini suspected involved a calculation on Carrasco's part about the value of cooperation relative to the value of a prosecutable case against 2 people with no names on file. Celine was waiting in a room with bad fluorescent lighting and a table with a water pitcher, when the door opened and Maya came through it. Maya was 28 years old and she looked, at this moment, approximately 42, which was what 12 hours of being held by strangers in an unknown location did to a person who had never been in danger before. Her eyes went immediately to Celine's face, and she covered the distance between them fast, and they held each other for a long time without speaking. And Celine let herself do this, let herself be held and hold back without the clinical management, without the distance, without the professional layer she'd been maintaining since midnight the previous night. Her shoulder hurt where Rayner's man had hit her. She didn't let go. When Maya finally pulled back, her face was complicated. Relief and anger, and the residue of fear, all occupying the same expression simultaneously. She looked at Celine's eyes, the way she'd looked at them when they were children, and Celine had done something that required explanation. "Tell me," Maya said. Celine told her. Not everything, not the full version. The version a person needed to understand what had happened and why. The version that would make sense of the past 20 hours without requiring a comprehensive briefing on 9 years of institutional corruption and the specific mechanics of a subfloor evidence archive. She told it directly, in sequence, without softening the edges. Maya listened. When Cellini finished, Maya was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Harlan Voss." "Yes." "He was..." "Yes." Maya looked at the table. You trusted him. For 9 years. And She stopped. For at least 4 of those 9 years, Celine said, he was on Magnus Rayner's payroll and directing cases away from evidence that would have exposed the operation. Maya sat with this. Her jaw was set in the way Celine recognized. The Vey jaw, their mother used to call it. The way both of them tightened against things they were processing that they weren't ready to speak about yet. Are you okay? Maya said finally. It was such a direct question. Such a simple direct question from a person who was asking the real thing and not the managed version. Not yet, Celine said, but the direction is right. Maya reached across the table and put her hand over Celine's. They stayed there until a federal liaison came to explain next steps, and even then they stayed in the room together for as long as they were permitted to. The debrief process took 3 days. Celine gave testimony to Carrasco's team, to an independent oversight body assembled from the DOJ's Inspector General's office, and to a federal grand jury that was convened within 72 hours of the tower operation, the speed of which told her that the media release had done exactly what it was designed to do, creating enough public and institutional pressure that the response couldn't be managed into a quiet corner. She told the truth in all 3 settings, the complete version, including the parts that implicated her own professional history, the 3 closed cases, the file transfers she'd accepted without adequate follow-up, the 2 years she'd attended the Meridian Foundation's annual medical conference without knowing what it funded. She didn't protect herself from the accounting. She wasn't interested in a version of this that positioned her as having been entirely outside the system's failures. She had been inside the system. The system had failed. Those things were both true, and she said so. Adrienne Marsh was arrested on the 2nd day. She did not contest the charges. Her cooperation with the federal investigation was extensive and provided corroboration for aspects of the Meridian Foundation's operation that the physical records alone hadn't fully documented. Celine was told this by Carrasco during a brief update meeting that also covered the status of 14 other individuals named in the records who were at various stages of the arrest and investigation process. The senator from Illinois, Celine said. Arrested yesterday morning, Carrasco said. 2 others are expected by end of week. The federal official, the one connected to Lena Draven's contact. She paused. That one is complicated by jurisdictional questions that are going to take time to resolve. How much time? More than it should, Carrasco said. She said it without inflection, and in the flatness of it was the honesty of a person who had been doing this work long enough to know the distance between what should happen and what did. But it will resolve, Celine said. Yes, Carrasco said. It will resolve. Magnus Rayner's legal team filed 17 motions in the first 48 hours. They were well-constructed motions. She read the summaries in the coverage that the international media outlets were running, the same outlets that had received her upload, which were now producing journalism of the kind that created its own institutional gravity, the kind that made quiet resolution politically and legally impossible. The motions addressed chain of custody, the methodology of the evidence collection, the circumstances of the subfloor access. They were the arguments Kael had predicted, built on exactly the architecture of procedural complexity that powerful people used when the facts were too clear to contest directly. The physical archive made most of them irrelevant. 340 files, names, photographs, intake documentation, disposition records, physical objects that existed in the world and had been found in a location under Magnus Rayner's direct operational control. The motions addressed how they'd been found. They couldn't address what they were. On the 4th day, Celine was cleared to leave Chicago. She didn't leave immediately. She had things to do first. She went to her apartment, escorted by a federal liaison, which was a precaution against residual threat that she understood was probably unnecessary at this point, and accepted anyway. And she packed 2 bags with the things that were actually hers, her instruments, the reference text that had her annotations in the margins, the photograph of her mother that had lived on her dresser for 11 years, a sweater that Maya had given her 3 birthdays ago. She left the furniture. She left the professional awards on the wall. She left the accumulated texture of a life in a city that had tried to kill her and that she was, she understood, not returning to. She sat in the apartment for 20 minutes before she left and let herself look at it. Then she got up and walked out. She went to Chicago Metropolitan. Not through the main entrance, through the loading dock on the north face. The way she'd exited 11 days ago with blood on her cuff and a titanium capsule against her ribs. She went to the forensic pathology department. She stood in the doorway of Autopsy Suite B and looked at the table and the lamp and the organized environment of the room she'd worked in for 9 years. The camera in the corner had a new recording light. Someone had repaired it. She stood there for a while. Then she walked to the secondary suite. Harlan Voss's workstation had been processed by federal investigators, and the surface was clear of the personal accumulation that had been there for 9 years. The photograph was gone. She'd expected that. Evidence processing took everything that might be relevant, and a photograph on a workstation was exactly the kind of item that got bagged and labeled in case it mattered. She thought about what he'd said when she'd asked him about keeping a photograph of someone you weren't speaking to. Just because something is broken doesn't mean you stop looking at it. She thought about the 4 years, maybe longer. The cases she'd flagged and he'd transferred. The secondary examination on the John Doe that he'd directed to her, specifically because he'd known she'd find what Carver had hidden and had planned to tell them the moment she did. She thought about whether the 9 years before that had been real, whether the mentorship, the protection, the slow transmission of how to look at things without flinching, whether any of it had been genuine or whether it had all been management of a different kind. She stood in the secondary suite and held this question and did not resolve it because some things didn't resolve cleanly, and the work of living with that was its own kind of practice. She left the hospital. She saw Kyle once more before she left the city. It was arranged through Carrasco, not officially, but with Carrasco's knowledge, which amounted to the same thing. A room in the federal building, supervised, 30 minutes. Kyle's legal situation was what she'd expected it to be, complex, protracted, with an outcome that would take months to determine and that depended on the cooperation calculations being made by multiple parties simultaneously. He was not in custody in the traditional sense. There were negotiations happening at a level above Carrasco's operation that Cellini wasn't privy to and suspected involved the kind of institutional horse trading that federal operations conducted when a criminal network had done its work for them at significant personal cost. He was not free, but he was not confined. He was in the room when she came in, standing, which she'd expected. The cut above his eyebrow had been attended to, a line of surgical tape closing it, the surrounding skin bruised to a deep purple that hadn't fully developed when she'd last seen him. He looked like someone who had been through something and was now in the phase of absorbing it, which was the same way she probably looked to him. They sat across the table. For a moment, neither of them said anything, which was a thing she'd noticed was specific to being around him. The silences didn't have the anxious quality that silences in most professional contexts carried. They were simply intervals between sentences. "Your sister," he said. "She's okay," Celine said. "She's staying with a friend in Ann Arbor while she figures out what comes next. She keeps calling me." "That's good." "She called me 4 times yesterday. That's not her usual pattern." She paused. "She's scared the threat isn't over." "The primary threat is over," he said. "I know. I told her." She looked at him. "She'll believe it eventually." He nodded. "The oversight body confirmed the third server received partial data before isolation," she said. "Carrasco told me this morning. It's not complete, maybe 40% of the transfer. But the first 2 servers have the full set and the coverage has been running for 4 days. She paused. "It's done. The thing we needed to do." "Yes," he said. "Lena," she said. He was still. "The federal investigation is going to surface everything, including the contacts she used, the specific sequence of what happened to her." She held his look. "It's going to be on record. Her name is going to be on record. The truth of what she did and what it cost her is going to be documented completely." She paused. "I know that's not the same as—" "No," he said. "It's not. But it's not nothing." He looked at her for a long moment. In his face was the thing she'd been watching since a parking structure and a server room and a cold storage corridor. The thing that lived underneath the operational management. The thing that was actually him and had nothing to do with criminal networks or phantom intelligence operations or 3 years of systematic revenge architecture. "No," he said quietly. "It's not nothing." They sat with that. "Where are you going?" he said. Coastal Maine. There's a small hospital in a town called Arden Point that needs a forensic pathology consultant. Temporary position, 6 months to start. She paused. I contacted them this morning. Forensic pathology in coastal Maine. People die in coastal Maine with ambiguous circumstances like they die everywhere else. They need someone who knows how to look at things honestly. She paused. I need somewhere quiet for a while. He nodded. And you, she said. He looked at the middle distance for a moment. That's being determined by other people right now, he said. Not bitterly, just accurately. Will it be determined well? Carrasco is reasonable, he said. The people above her are making calculations. I've been making calculations long enough to understand how those conversations go. He paused. I expect I'll be useful to someone for a while, and then less useful, and then it will resolve. That's a very calm way to describe your legal situation. I've had 4 days to get calm about it. She looked at him. If it resolves the way I think it resolves, she said, and in the time frame that seems likely, Arden Point is 7 hours from Chicago. He looked at her. She held his look and didn't look away. That's a geographical observation, he said carefully. It is, she said. The 30 minutes expired. The federal liaison appeared in the door. Celine stood. Kyle stood. She picked up her bag from the floor and looked at him one last time in the fluorescent light of a federal building interview room, and what she saw in his face was not a promise. She wasn't looking for a promise, but a direction. The same direction he'd given her when she'd needed one most. Not soft, not managed, present. She went to Arden Point. The town was small in the way of coastal Maine towns that had always been small and intended to remain so. A harbor, a main street, a hospital that served the surrounding county and was staffed by people who had made a deliberate choice about the scale at which they wanted to practice medicine. The hospital director was a man named Flynn, who shook her hand without ceremony and showed her the pathology suite with the practical directness of someone who had been waiting a long time to have the position filled and was not interested in extended pleasantries. The suite was smaller than Chicago Metropolitan's. The equipment was current, well-maintained, the organized environment of a facility that took its work seriously without the institutional infrastructure of a major urban hospital. It was sufficient. It was, in fact, exactly sufficient. She worked. The first case she processed was a drowning from the harbor. A fisherman, 64, found floating by another vessel in the early morning. She worked it with the same methodology she'd brought to every case for 9 years, careful, thorough, without assumptions permitted ahead of evidence. The cause was consistent with the circumstances. She documented it cleanly and passed the report to Flynn. He read it and said without looking up, "This is thorough." "It's standard," she said. "Not around here it hasn't been," he said. "Thank you." She went back to her office. She sat for a moment with the Atlantic visible from the single window. Gray, in particular, the specific ocean gray of October in Maine. A different color than any lake, a different quality of horizon. She thought about Chicago at this distance, and it felt like looking at something through many layers of glass, still visible, still itself, but altered by the medium you were looking through. She thought about Harlan Voss. She thought about the 3 transferred cases, and the examination she hadn't run, and the secondary review she hadn't pushed for, and the ways in which trust, over 9 years, had done some of her professional work for her, had allowed her to accept a determination she might otherwise have questioned, because the person delivering it had earned a degree of her confidence that she'd never recalibrated. She thought about what it meant to recalibrate. Not just professionally, the broader practice of it. She opened the top drawer of the office desk and removed a legal pad, a new one, different from the one she'd left in Rogers Park, and set it on the desk surface and looked at it for a moment. Then she picked up a pen and wrote at the top of the first page, "Cases requiring secondary review." She had a list she'd been building in her head for 4 days. Cases from the past 9 years that she'd flagged and accepted transfer on. Cases that she'd processed and passed without flag that now, with different context, deserved a second look. Not because she was certain the findings were wrong, because she was no longer certain they were right, which was a different standard but the only honest one. She would work through the list. It would take time. The records were distributed across multiple jurisdictions, and some of them would be inaccessible. transferred to federal custody or sealed pending the Rayner investigation. But she would work through what she could reach and document what she found and send it to Carrasco with the same completeness she'd brought to everything else. The dead deserved to be looked at honestly. They always had. She wrote the first name, then the second. Then she stopped and looked at the window for a while. At the harbor in the October afternoon, the fishing boats and the gray water and the horizon that was clear all the way to where it disappeared. And she let herself be, briefly, simply in the room, simply in the moment, in the specific quiet of a place that had no awareness of what she'd been or what she'd done or what the past 11 days had cost. It was October in coastal Maine, and she was alive and she was working, and outside the window the Atlantic was doing what it always did regardless of what happened on its shores. And there was something in that constancy that was not comfort exactly, but was adjacent to it. The simple fact of things continuing, the world's basic commitment to its own forward motion. She'd been afraid the night wouldn't end, on a subway car with bullets shattering the windows behind her. It had ended. She picked up the pen and continued the list. 3 months later, on an evening when the harbor was already dark by 5 and the cold coming off the water had a specific clarity that she'd learned to associate with early winter in Arden Point, she came back to her apartment after a late shift and found a package on the doorstep. No return address. Postmarked Chicago, 3 days prior. She took it inside and set it on the kitchen table under the overhead light and opened it with the same methodical attention she brought to everything, carefully, at the seam, preserving the packaging. Inside was a black envelope. Inside the envelope was a single chess piece. The king. Dark wood, weighted, the kind from a quality set. There was a faint smell of smoke about it that she suspected was intentional. A detail added because the person who sent it understood that details communicated what sentences sometimes couldn't. Beneath it, a folded card. Handwritten. The handwriting was not what she'd expected. Not the clipped efficiency she'd anticipated, but something slower, more deliberate, as if each word had been considered before being committed. You were never meant to die that night. Neither was she. I'll find you when I can get there. K. Celine stood in her kitchen in coastal Maine with a chess piece in her hand and a card that said 7 words more than she'd expected, and she held them for a long moment in the quiet of a place that had nothing to do with anything that had come before it. She set the king on the kitchen windowsill. She put the card in the top drawer of her desk, under the legal pad. She went to bed. She slept, and outside the window the harbor moved in its dark way, and the Atlantic kept its distance, and the world continued in its forward motion, patient and without judgment, indifferent to the weight of what people carried, and equally indifferent to the fact that sometimes, not always, not easily, not without costs that could not be fully accounted for, they managed to carry it all the way through.